welcome to all the people who have joined this virtual brainstorming meeting. And may I request you to please keep your mic at mute, except the chairs, speakers, and discussants. May I also request all of you to use the chat box only to pose your questions, and we can do the greetings later on in the open discussion. So let's keep the chat box only for question and answers. Dr. Paroda sir, if you will permit and the co-chairs will permit, we can start the function formally. In which case, I invite Dr. Sunil Archak, National Fellow ICR NBPGR and Editor-in-Chief of the Indian Society of Plant Genetic Resources, to kindly moderate today's virtual brainstorming meeting and take the session forward.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Anuradha. Good morning, speakers, both of you, and good afternoon to all our colleagues from India. Welcome to virtual brainstorming on DSI and germplasm sharing. Without wasting a lot of time, I invite and request Dr. Kuldeep Singh, Director NBPGR, to present his welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Sunil. Good afternoon, good morning, namaskar. It's my privilege to welcome you all to this virtual meeting, which will be dealing with digital sequence information and germplasm sharing. Dr. R.S. Paroda, President of the TAS and President of Indian Society of Plant Genetic Resources. Our two eminent speakers, Ms. Anke Haak and Pierre Plessis, representing International Seed Federation and African Union Commission. Our all former directors of NBPGR who are holding many other positions, but I will address them as the directors of NBPGR. Dr. R.S. Rana, Dr. B.S. Dillon, Dr. S.K. Sharma, Dr. K.C. Bansal. We are missing one director at the moment. He's not keeping well, otherwise he'll be with us as well. Then we have the representatives from the treaty. I hope Daniele has joined us. We have representation from BCIL, Dr. Vibha Ahuja. We have representation from the seed industry, represented by Dr. Shivendra Bajaj. Representation from the legal fraternity, represented by Niti Wilson. From the CG institutions, represented by Pooja Bhatnagar at the moment. We have the representation from the farmers, represented by Tanmay Joshi. And my co-chair, Dr. R.C. Agarwal. My other colleagues of the society, Dr. Sunil Archak, Dr. Anuradha, heads of the divisions of NBPGR, many other members of the ICR institutions, state agricultural universities. You see Dr. Jagjit Singh Sandhu, the Vice Chancellor of Shri Karananda University for Agricultural Sciences at Jobner, and many others who are 143 participants. I welcome you all to this virtual meeting, which is on digital sequence information and germplasm sharing. Although Sunil will give you more details of the background of this one, but I may tell with the whole group here that with the technological revolutions, especially in the area of genome sequencing and the digital and the genome editing, there has been a paradigm shift now in the thinking about the sharing of the genetic resources. Something probably 10 years or 20 years back, we would not have even dreamed of this thing when the treatment was discussed. Now, this issue is not that simple. It's a complex issue, and many countries have divergent views about the DSI, which is digital sequence information, being represented by many other terms at the moment. And this is being deliberated and debated and discussed at several forms, including both at the CBD as well as the treaty. And in fact, a lot needs to be still debated on the use of DSI. To my all colleagues here, to tell them that the 8th governing body meeting of the treaty ended without any consensus on the use of the DSI, or rather including this terminology in the treaty. So that was a contention or a point where the different parties couldn't really come to the consensus. And I'm sure this will be a point of debate in the GB9, which is scheduled in India in December 2021. This virtual meeting, in fact, it's Dr. Paroda who is the person behind it. It is with his consistent support to us that Indian Society of Genetics
Sir, Dr. Kuldeep Singh, you have to unmute yourself. Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay. I request all to please keep on the mute. It disturbs. Please. Who is
So
this?
it is basically, this meeting is an informal meeting, and our basic objective of this conference is to learn more about the global viewpoints, the divergent viewpoints different countries have, so that once we understand most of the things, we can prepare a country position on that one. So this meeting is completely informal, and Sunil will give you more details of this one. But thanks to Dr. Paroda, who has been consistently advising us and asking us to hold this meeting. And in fact, today it came, sir, finally, and I'm sure we understand you have some pressing meetings thereafter, but despite that, you have been able to join us and pursue us on this one. So once again, I welcome you all to this virtual meeting, and where we will learn more about the different viewpoints represented by two very learned speakers of the world, Annie and Perry. Welcome you all once again. Floor is with you, Sunil, now.
Thank you very much, sir. May I now invite Dr. R.S. Paroda, our mentor and former director of NBPGR, former Director General and Secretary DARE, Government of India, to present special remarks to set the tone for today's deliberation, sir.
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to this afternoon's brainstorming that is being arranged by the Indian Society of Plant Genetic Resources. Being current chair of the society, it's my privilege to welcome you all. Your presence makes all the difference to deliberate on this important subject, which is of considerable relevance, and I'm sure our guest speakers will highlight the importance of this subject more in detail as we listen to them. Nonetheless, we are learning in the area of genetic resource conservation and management since we were almost young students. I only recall we were told that genetic resources are common heritage of humankind and they are exchanged freely. Then we were told, no, you have to have your sui generis system and protect these genetic resources. So we started with TT, then we came up with CBD, and then started learning the mechanisms of multilateral exchange system, and then bilateral exchange system. And then started talking about rights, farmers' rights, plant breeders' rights, and then started bringing in laws in different countries, which we are still trying to understand. And then it also came up that you would not be able to move forward for meeting the newer challenges unless you continue exchanging these genetic resources, which are otherwise very important and would be needed to meet the emerging challenges, whether relating to natural resource degradation, whether relating to human nutrition, whether it is relating to climate change and so on. And in that respect, we had to then understand that you need to also take care of in situ conservation, not only ex situ. And when you think of in situ, then you have to also see what could be the mechanisms of access and benefit sharing. So we are in fact really having many issues emerging step by step. And obviously for that we have to build our human resource capability, institutional support. Fortunately, India is moving relatively much better compared to many other developing and least economic nations in the region. But I do see that despite all these, we need to really think of not only plants, but other biodiversity, whether it is livestock, whether it is fish, or whether it is relating to microorganisms, etc. So having said this, I would like to say that there are advances in science as well, and things have moved from that number game when we were plant breeders, struggling with the genetic variation in numbers of thousands, searching for some good combination, and you were lucky if you got one, then to the advances through biotechnology and now through genome editing. We are very happy that this year the Nobel Prize in Chemistry has gone to 2 women scientists, one from France and one from US, relating to CRISPR-Cas technology. That gives you great options for moving ahead with and faster progress with genetic enhancement. And it is in that context, information technology also has advanced very fast. And ICT has made the global village one. Today we are able to exchange big data, and all the genome sequences have opened up new opportunities. And the concern, which I would not like to dwell more in detail because I'm myself trying to learn about digital sequence information. The concern is that here you may not even possibly require exchange of physical materials. If you have the information, probably you will still be able to move ahead and construct the kind of combinations that you otherwise would want in your laboratory. But then the question is, who will hold the rights for this kind of invention? And what would happen to those who have either protected these resources or have provided access to this information? So there are issues. There will be legal issues. We would probably require, again, better understanding and have mechanisms to be put in place. And As Dr. Kuldeep Singh said, that this is being debated in the TT. It was very difficult for us to, at that time, I was chairing a group of working group on definition of farmers' right. At that time, it took us 2 years to come up with farmers' right concept. So DSI would also probably take some time till it is accepted. But there is no other way. Live with the advancements in science and still have a vision to capitalize what best you could. And in that process, I do see that there will be opportunities of not only access and benefit sharing through physical exchange of materials, but maybe through information exchange as well. So let us have this discussion, let us understand, let us try to see what more can be done. Maybe this is just a beginning, but it is better that we have started this dialogue. Otherwise, we will have to do it later. And we may possibly miss the bus by that time. So let's understand, let the Society of Plant Genetic Resources, which had hosted the first International Agrobiodiversity Congress in New Delhi in 2016 and came out with the Delhi Declaration, where access benefit sharing and knowledge management were highlighted as key issues for genetic resource use and management. I hope we will continue having this deliberation. You are all aware that second International Agrobiodiversity Congress is likely to be hosted by Italy this time through active role of the Italian government and also Bioversity International, in which we will also be the co-organizers. So we look forward that these deliberations will continue and we will have better understanding as we move along. So with this, I would not like to take more time, but look forward to listening and having better insight into this new area which is emerging, but which has great potential, and we will have to understand and live with it. And what do we do? How do we reorganize? And how can we get benefit? And it's not our benefit, it's benefit of the communities who are holding these genetic resources and protecting them for posterity, how they will get benefited. So these are the issues which we will have to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much indeed for these remarks. Before I start introducing the speakers, please allow me to just give a couple of housekeeping instructions. I would like to inform one and all, the speakers, the discussants, and the participants that the proceedings are being recorded and shall be available to public. Today, we are expecting a brainstorming, free exchange of ideas to shape the contours of the thought process. We are not aiming to develop a formal or official viewpoint right here today. The issue is complex, complicated, and significant. Let us understand the diverse elements of the topic to evolve our opinions and positions. Third and the last, I request all the participants to stick to the central topic of DSI, digital sequence information, and not digress to fringe items. We intend to collate views of stakeholders vis-a-vis DSI rather than general perspective about biotechnology or economics or social issues, etc. Thank you very much. Now, allow me to introduce today's speakers. The first speaker is Ms. Anke van der Herk. After receiving her Masters of Science in Plant Breeding in 1992, one second, sorry. She started her profession as a vegetable breeder at Newnham's. Subsequently, she worked at the International Plant Genetic Research Institute, erstwhile Biodiversity International, for 5 years. Right now, she is working as the Deputy Director at Plantum after being with Plantum for around 2 decades. Plantum is a Dutch association for breeding, that's a seed sector. Among others, she is specialized in the field of biodiversity, in particular access and benefit sharing. She participates in the various meetings of International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resource for Food and Agriculture, the Convention on Biological Diversity, as representative of the seed sector. She is a permanent fixture almost in all these meetings since I have been participating. To represent the sector, she is active in the various industry fora dealing with ABS, such as the International Seed Federation, the European Seed Association, CIOPORA, the International Chamber of Commerce. Within ISF, she chairs the working group dealing with biodiversity. So you can see that she has all the flavor. She has worked as a breeder, worked with biodiversity, and now she has been working with the seed sector. Our next speaker is Mr. Pierre Duplessis. Studied economic history and has worked in sustainable development for 34 years. I can tell you, literally and figuratively, he is a tall figure, towering figure in this area. In 1999, he started concentrating on the commercialization of indigenous natural products from Africa, and soon after developed a specialist focus on access to genetic resources and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising from their use. He was one of Africa's lead negotiators during the development of Nagoya Protocol and has frequently represented Namibia and Africa at various international fora, including CBD, WIPO, and FAO. In the international treaty, he participates in the working group to enhance the functioning of MLS. He has co-chaired the Committee on Funding Strategy, as well as he has served on the Scientific Advisory Committee on Global Information System. Mr. Duplessis is currently the technical advisor to the African Union Continental Coordination Committee on Biodiversity, Biosafety, and ABS. And you can see that in the current discussions on MLS enhancement, where we discussed a lot about DSI, both of them have been prominent figures representing the extreme ends of the spectrum of deliberations. So we are very fortunate that we have both of them today with us. And I request now the first speaker, Ms. Anke, to start her presentation. Anke, would you like to share your slides from your end?
I'm going to try that, yes.
Please.
Let's see. You can see the presentation?
Yeah, but if you can put it on the presentation mode.
Oh, okay. In my, let me see.
F5.
No, it's not working. Stop share. I try once more.
Yeah, please.
Already in full screen mode.
But I can't share.
May I share?
Let it be. No, Sunil, let
yes,
us present
please.
in the same way. There is no problem.
Address.
She's not able to.
Okay, thank you. Dear distinguished guest, and sorry for this hiccup. When we exercised sharing the slides, it worked, but unfortunately, I have to do it in this way now. Dear distinguished guest, thank you very much for inviting me to this important event on digital sequence information with all those prominent people. Digital sequence information is a topic that is for several years on the international policy agenda now. In this presentation, I would like to provide you with some questions that we think need to be answered before deciding if it will be wise to decide if DSI should be regulated or not. It is of course up to the parties of the various fora to take a final decision in this regard. In this presentation, I would like to indicate from the plant breeder's perspective how we look at it and what the possible implications of regulations are for the sector. Oh, yeah. First of all, it will be good to understand why the discussion on the DSI started. There are probably 2 points that triggered that discussion. The first one is the expectations on benefit sharing were not reached. And the second one, the fear that benefit sharing can be circumvented by using DNA sequence information and gene editing like CRISPR-Cas rather than the genetic resources themselves. Next slide. The expectations on benefit sharing were not reached. We agree that the expectations were not reached. In our opinion, there are several reasons for this. First of all, it is due to the fact that the expectations from the different stakeholders were very far apart. And then some people expected to receive benefit sharing on resources that had been exchanged in the past, which is legally problematic. Furthermore, the time to develop a product was not always taken into account. This was clearly seen in the discussion of the ITPGRFA. In 2013, the discussion started on revamping the multilateral system of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources for Food and Agriculture. Only 6 years after the Standard Material Transfer Agreement had been agreed upon, let alone being implemented, what probably was most of the times later. A plant breeding cycle, especially when crop wild relatives of farmer varieties are used, will take at least 6 years, but often more than 15 to 20 years. So in other words, benefit sharing could not have come in yet in 2013. Breeders have several criteria to select genetic resources to be used in their breeding program. These have to do with the ease on reaching a new product, the crossability, and the knowledge on the characteristics present in the genetic resource. And lately, another criteria was added, access and benefit sharing requirements. In case a genetic resource is easily accessible under reasonable conditions, these will be selected more often and others will not. Next slide. Another element that was difficult to deal with in the expectations is the non-monetary benefit sharing. Plant breeders, stop. Oh. Yes, thanks. That was difficult is the non-monetary benefit sharing. Plant breeders have always been ready to collaborate with universities and research institutes around the globe. Also in developing countries to share knowledge, to train people, and to do any other capacity building. The valuation of these activities in terms of benefit sharing is difficult. And another very important manner of benefit sharing is the so-called breeders' exemption. This means that finalized products from plant breeders, also when they are protected with plant breeders' rights, are free for research, breeding, and commercialization of the product that is developed out of it. Modern varieties are very often used in both participatory and scientific breeding. This meant in India, for example, that breeders could use the improved tomato varieties that were developed in Europe with resistance to tomato spotted wild virus without going to have to go back to the crop wild relatives. and implicitly the complex and long breeding process. And they did not have to pay for that to the original breeder. Limiting that open innovation aspect of plant breeding would be devastating for global crop improvement, which is so dearly necessary at times of climate change, urbanization, and ongoing nutrition security problems. Next. And last but not least, no real discussion has ever taken place on what is fair and equitable. How to value a genetic resource when its contribution to the value of a final product can hardly be assessed next to the value of the investment and creative work of the user, the plant breeder in this case. So many questions remain on how to solve the question of fair and equitable benefit sharing and therefore managing the expectations. Next slide. So some people feel that the use of genetic resources is circumvented. In plant breeding, it is seriously the question whether breeders can actually circumvent the use of genetic resources itself by using DSI. Moreover, if already possible, is it cost efficient to do so? It is broadly agreed by breeders that gene editing, like CRISPR-Cas, will not, and I repeat, will not replace the work of the breeder. It may be a complementary tool in the breeder's toolbox. Biotechnology researchers may think differently, but we heard that at the start of the transgenics discussions as well. Plants will not be created synthetically from building blocks of DNA. Their physiology and metabolic pathways and interactions of traits with environments are far too complex. So if this already could happen, it's still a long time away that this will happen. Plant breeders make many crosses each year. Depending on the crop and the size of the program, this may differ from dozens to hundreds to thousands. They use over 95% advanced and improved materials for this. And only in rare cases, they may use other materials like research materials, farmers' varieties, or crop wild relatives. This can introduce new diversity in elite materials in the crop, both intended traits, but from a diversity point of view, more importantly, less visible genetic diversity, the value of which cannot be assessed at all. Some may say that the use of sequence information may be used in some of the newer gene editing breeding technologies. This may happen in the future. The most impressive wins will be when applied probably in perennial and polyploid crops, the breeding of which is extremely slow. Next. Then we come to a second important question. It needs to be considered if one wants to make fundamental change on the availability of knowledge. Do you want to legally limit the use of knowledge, which is a very different thing than a physical resource? More and more organizations realize the need for open source data policies. You see, for example, also that more and more nationally and internationally recognized scientific magazines are freely accessible for all. Plant breeders are in general very critical about patents on plants that provide an exclusive right on their use by others. Instead, the open innovation system Plant Breeders' Rights has been developed that provides support to investments in breeding without, and I repeat again, without restricting access to knowledge. Do we really want to go into the opposite direction? To answer the question if this fundamental change is a wise step to take, several elements need to be thought through. First of all, the effect on innovation and the diversity in crops that farmers can choose from. Secondly, the amounts of benefit sharing that can be expected. And thirdly, the consequence for use and conservation of biodiversity. Next slide. So first, let's have a look at the effect on innovation. We are living in an era of data collection, or big data, what was mentioned already before. Through different techniques, we can collect data, we can compare data, and therefore we can learn new elements. I saw, for example, a piece of remote sensing work from World Veg. They study the behavior of vegetable plants that are put under flood conditions. They follow the growing process and then can compare data. And their work will be seriously hindered if they cannot download sequence data from the internet and if they cannot share the data they generate in the field. One of the researchers even said, if we cannot do that any longer, we will go back to the 70s. And this will tremendously hamper the breeding efforts of flooding tolerant varieties that are important for farmers in the rainy and hot seasons. And you may say that DSI remains accessible under conditions. But are these reasonable and doable? And can we deliver for food security and climate change? Unfortunately, we as breeders do not have very positive experiences with the current Nagoya Protocol and the access to genetic resources itself. The process to access genetic resources is often long and uncertain and mostly disappointing, not leading to a workable collaboration and/or benefit sharing arrangement. Next slide. And what does it mean for the Indian innovation capacity? In these pictures, you can see that India is a net user of DSI from the big genetic sequence databases. So what if you have to start paying for it? Next slide. Another important element to consider is the effect of regulated data on public-private partnerships. Many companies and research organizations would like to work together to do whatever type of research. We see nowadays that collaboration may sometimes become more difficult. This is in several cases due to access and benefit sharing arrangements. Now it is linked to genetic resources as such. Can people share genetic resources? Is sufficiently knowledge available to do the benefit sharing obligations, etc.? But imagine what it could mean for digital sequence information. You need to have a clear and workable approach for the DSI you are planning to use, but also for the DSI that will be generated in the public-private partnership. Are the generators of new DSI able to use that DSI? And if so, under what conditions? I would also like to discuss the risk of every developer taking care of her own data set to avoid dealing with the public DSI. A lot of duplicate efforts, which leads away from the real innovation steps that could be made with the same amount of money and effort. Moreover, this may create also a bigger gap between the large and small and medium-sized organizations. The first ones have the capacity to create their own data set, while the latter do not have that opportunity. And I would like to reiterate that open sources do work, and that can be seen within the plant variety protection legislation and the breeder's exemption. The breeder's exemption, also recognized and implemented in India, demonstrates that breeders have access to all the varieties, genetic resources that have been developed for further research and breeding without having any additional obligations towards the owner of the original material. Next slide. The regulation of DSI may be seen as attractive for benefit sharing. Is it for the money, or is it for non-monetary benefit sharing? It is important to have a clear idea on what is expected in monetary and non-monetary contributions. To do so, it should not be based on wishful thinking, but be based on the real situation in practice. So you need to know how urgent DSI is for the users and for which users. And secondly, you need to understand the impact of the costs for DSI on research and development. Will it be worth the money? Collaboration and cooperation are also a recurring theme in the Convention on Biological Diversity and its Nagoya Protocol. For example, in Article 10E of the Convention, where contracting parties have committed themselves to encourage cooperation between its governmental organizations and the private sector to develop methods for sustainable use of biological resources. In the annex to the Nagoya Protocol, sharing of know-how, collaboration, cooperation, and contribution in scientific research and development programs are listed as non-monetary benefits. Good examples of such cooperation are the different public-private projects aimed at sequencing specific food crops. Examples are the Spinach Genome Sequencing Consortium, the work of the Center of the Biosystem Genomics, and the International Wheat Genome Sequence Consortium. With the financial support of the private sector, universities and research organizations generate sequence information, which after a short confidentiality period becomes available to the general public worldwide through publications and open access databases. This allows other researchers to apply and build upon these results in their own research, while also improving available sequence information that can generate more biological insight. Next to looking at the amounts and workable system, it is important to look at the transaction costs, often not considered. It's currently seen that the transactions costs of the Nagoya Protocol often outreach the benefit sharing income. So in other words, a clear business case needs to be made. And you got already this slide, the consequence for use and conservation of biodiversity. The whole discussion takes place in the context of the CBD and other related fora. DSI is essential for ex situ conservation to identify and eliminate duplicates in collections and reduce cost, as well as to ensure that material is being collected and conserved that represents the relevant diversity. Also, for in situ conservation, DSI is needed. It is used to measure genetic diversity and thereby ensure that diversity is effectively conserved in natural area and in around the field. And also to monitor how it evolves in response to environment changes. So also here the question will be what the consequences of restricting the access to DSI will imply. Next slide. Finally, the third question certainly for the lawmakers among you, the question how or whether regulation of DSI may be possible, implementable, and enforceable. And this question has not been answered yet. Scientists have indicated to me that this question is extremely complex, that it may work with international databases, notably those available to university scientists in health research, but that in other areas, it may even trigger companies to stop uploading the sequence information that they have produced themselves, since their own further use would trigger payments. It appears that a lot of people in the debate are talking about possible regulation of digital sequence information in order to improve benefit sharing payments, or just as change in the political arena to be swapped with agreement on other policy issues. But nobody really wants to deal with the question of implementation and enforcement. Moreover, nobody would like to really consider that the value of the current situation is positive for innovation. Not regulating may be the best option for global and local food and nutrition security and welfare. Several elements need to be agreed upon before it can be analyzed whether the regulation could work towards the defined objective and what the collateral damage could be. We need to look into the following elements: the definition of digital sequence information, understanding which DSI is included, who is really owning DSI, the participation of the user in the system, and the possibilities to control. Next slide. All people in the debate on DSI seem to have different ideas on the meaning of it. These range from nucleotide sequence data to proteins, their metabolites, and subsidiary information. Some even talk on any information that may relate to a plant or a crop or a genetic resource in general. It is still a hard nut to crack on how to define it. Obviously, a definition has to be clear when you want to discuss the possibility to regulate it. Next slide. Understand the scope of the DSI included in a system. Which DSI will be included in a possible regulatory framework? Is it the information that is found in public databases? And if so, in which databases? Do organizations have to register those databases if it is from a signatory country? Is it the country where the server is located? How to deal with countries that may not participate? And what if organizations, including private ones, that do not want to participate in the system and or want to offer the information for free, how to deal with those? And of course, there may be countries that do not participate at all. How do you make the system forward-looking? In other words, how do you start the regulation? To be honest, I don't know if you can force people and private persons in countries that are party to the CBD and or Nagoya Protocol to participate. And of course, there the question will remain if you want that. DSI is not necessarily unique. So this means that the same DSI can occur at different places from different accessions or even organisms. What will be the implications of this matter? Next slide. And who is the owner of DSI? Is it the one that does the research to create the DSI? Or is it the country of origin of the genetic resource, or a country that has acquired genetic resource in accordance with the convention? Should anyone intending to sequence DNA have pick and mud, prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms? And what to do if the owner of DSI cannot be determined? Do you want to regulate DSI bilaterally or multilaterally? And how do you avoid double payment? Next slide. the participation of the users in the system. How can a user make the choice to participate or not participate in a possible system? And how the rules will be made clear and implementable for the user. With the current Nagoya Protocol, we see in many countries that legislation occurs, but to really make an access and benefit sharing agreement in practice is often another thing and not doable. Will this be different for DSI? Next slide. As indicated earlier, it may be already tough, if not impossible, to create rules and regulations on the utilization of DSI. It's probably even harder to implement and control such a system. How do you prove that DSI is accessed? How to prove that such access led to use? And if so, which DSI has actually contributed to a final product? So ideas are floating around. In the meantime, several ideas on how to regulate DSI are floating around. But if you are trying to get into the details of those options, be they bilateral or multilateral, it is the questions if the systems are possible, implementable, and/or controllable. We are convinced that the status quo already brings a lot of complication. So it will not be a surprise that we are of the opinion that DSI in the public domain should remain freely available. This might, however, be the time for a paradigm shift in the debate of access and fair and equitable benefit sharing. I wonder whether expanding the concept of genetic resources to DSI is a wise way to go. Next slide. So to conclude, I think it is important to decide if it is wise to regulate DSI, it will be important to answer the three questions. Why did the discussion on DSI start? Could there be other ways to reach the same target? Does one want to make a fundamental change on the availability of knowledge? What is the cost of going against the tide of open source knowledge sharing? And is it possible at all to regulate DSI in an implementable and controllable manner? Next one. I hope I gave you sufficient food for thought, and I'm looking forward to the further discussion. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anke. Thank you for bringing all these multifarious individual elements and relationships. Thank you very much. If both the co-chairs permit me, let me take questions and then points at the end of both the presentations.
Yes, that's fresh.
And some of the couple of points where their questions were asked as to the presenters, they expected the presenters to take positions, yes or no kind of things. So I thought they could gather from what Anke was mentioning that it's pretty complicated and unclear. So let's keep it outside the deliberations of the treaty and various international fora. First, let us hear what PRA says about what PRA thinks about all these things, and then discuss more on that. PRA, would you like to share your slides, please, now? Yeah, they are visible. Excellent. If you are speaking, you perhaps are muted. You may like to unmute yourself, PRA. Yeah. Please unmute yourself. Yeah, your mic is still muted.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I realized it was, I just couldn't find the button because I had gone to presentation mode.
Yeah, welcome again. Welcome.
Technology. Thank you very much. And good afternoon to everyone. Good morning for those of you who are not in India. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this presentation. Um, as Sunil said in his introduction, Anki and I come from like quite the opposite extremes of this discussion, but we have developed a certain rapport over the years, so I wasn't very surprised to hear what she had to say. I have, of course, a slightly different view on it, but there are some things we agree on. Let's see if we can identify those along the way. I really wouldn't insult you by trying to explain to you what genetics is and how it works and so on. But I think it is important in the international discussions to recognize that DSI doesn't have an agreed meaning, that it came out of COP16 up to COP13 as a placeholder term. But in fact, the issue was first raised within the context of the international treaty. In 2013, when Shakil Bhatti stood up in Oman in his keynote address to the governing body and pointed out that dematerialized genetic resources represented a potential problem for the multilateral system. Right? So I think that's a very important element to consider, because the discussion then also very shortly after that came up at the World Health Organization in the pandemic influenza preparedness framework context, again from the perspective of bypassing benefit sharing arrangements, which had been agreed there for influenza viruses. When it was discussed at the CBD, in fact, it was originally discussed within the context of synthetic biology, where genetic engineering techniques were being used to modify tame industrialized yeasts so as to produce high value natural products through genetic engineering without any benefit sharing with the country of origin, and also no consideration for the livelihoods of the thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions of farmers who would be pushed out of the market through these synthetic products, which, just to add insult to injury, industry then promoted as natural because they're the product of fermentation of a genetically modified yeast. There's also arguments going on about whether DSI is in fact a genetic resource, and those arguments swivel on the definitional position of material. So a genetic resource is material of animal, plant, or microbial or other origin that contains functional units of heredity. It's a bit of a sophistry going on there. It's a very philosophical argument. My view on it is that there's nothing in the world that isn't material to the best of our scientific knowledge. And if you can email a gene sequence from Indonesia to Geneva and reconstitute the flu virus in a laboratory in Geneva, then surely that emailed sequence was a functional unit of heredity. So in my view, this definitional argument is simply an effort by developed countries to kick the problem into the long grass. But even if you ignore that, it's very clear that DSI comes from the use of a genetic resource, and therefore under the Nagoya Protocol and the international treaty, there's a clear obligation to share the benefits that come from that use. Discussing what DSI is, of course, there was an ad hoc technical expert group at the CBD who spent quite a bit of time doing on this. I was a member of that group. We didn't actually manage to cover everything in our brief because that was the first meeting that had been moved online as a result of the pandemic, and everyone at that stage was still learning how to do online meetings. But we did come up with this very useful table which looks at different things that could be understood to be genetic sequence information. And it moves in a continuum, if you look at it from the left to the right, basically from the simplest form of information, which is kind of inherent in the genetic resource. All right, so these are the nucleic acid sequence read, and so the stuff that you can nowadays pull out of a genetic resource very, very easily and cheaply, and you can even get service providers to do it for you at a very low cost. And then there's a second group, which includes the first group and then adds to it proteins and epigenetic modifications. And then there's a third group, which is even further away from the original genetic resource, which then looks at things like metabolites and other macromolecules that are expressed by the nucleic acid sequences and the amino acid sequences and the proteomics of the genetic resource. And it's just as a matter of interest, I read an article yesterday about the technological advances that are being made in ability to edit proteins. So if you think that genetic editing is our current sort of leading edge, in fact, proteomic editing is right on its heels. And then in the column on the right, the associated information, the RTEC agreed that this is not in fact digital sequence information. So the most important one there is traditional knowledge associated with the genetic resources. And that, of course, doesn't mean that the traditional knowledge is not important. It doesn't undermine the rights that indigenous people and local communities have to that traditional knowledge. It's simply to flag that that traditional knowledge is a different kind of knowledge from digital sequence information and has to be dealt with and accommodated in any arrangement in a different way. So why is digital sequence information important for plant genetic resources for food and agriculture? I think the most obvious example of why it's important is because you can search online databases for accessions with target sequences. So if you know the sequence that's associated with a particular trait, you can go and you can very quickly find accessions that would have that trait, which would significantly shorten and simplify your selection of initial accessions for a breeding program. And that pre-selection of accessions would make your breeding much quicker and cheaper and easier. And then you can do gene editing to transfer desirable traits into lines that already have other, for example, agronomic traits that you're looking to cement. And you don't run the risk of interfering with those heritable traits when you do precision gene editing. Then, as I've mentioned, there's the problem of synthetic biology replacing high-value natural products. And Anke also pointed to this. This does create this use of digital sequence information, which is the use of a very large data set to find the relevance and value of a particular sequence, where the data set, in other words, functions as the background against which you can clearly see what the sequence is very important. But it has the problem that you use many sequences all at the same time, and that because you use a lot of sequences at the same time, it's hard to track and trace which sequences you use, and it's hard to legally imagine how you would then share the benefits across all of those many sequences. At least that's very difficult to imagine when you're trying to preserve the bilateral aspects of the current ABS system. It's also important to bear in mind that this is one side of the picture. This like large data set that gives you a rich background and enables you to do a whole lot of things is distinct from the value of an individual sequence. All right, and that individual sequence might well be the one that encodes the blockbuster billion-dollar trait that will transform nutritional security and allow us to grow adequate food under climate change scenarios. So you have this tension between the individual sequence, which comes from a genetic resource that is under the sovereign national control of a contracting party to the CBD in many cases, or comes from a multilateral system like the one of the treaty where there are agreed rules for what you're allowed to do with those resources, and importantly, what you're not allowed to do with those resources. And then, I mean, acknowledging that there's a problem with the sheer amount of information and the difficulty of tracking and tracing it. Now, when we were discussing this in the working group to enhance the functioning of the multilateral system, I got interviewed by a journalist who then also interviewed somebody from Monsanto, or not, well, he was with Monsanto before that, who told her that these concerns about gene editing in the plant genetic resources space, at least, was science fiction. And Anke sort of indirectly also referred to it as not being practical, not being a reality at the moment. I thought I would just share with you two examples of how come that's not true. The one of them is this visual analytical web tool that allows you to search 22,626 barley accessions from a German gene bank and basically look for any sequence in there. And it's even like a simplified graphic user interface, so you can really go there and you can trawl through all of those accessions and quickly find what you're looking for in your particular barley breeding program. Or you could even find, characteristics that you might then use gene editing to transfer to other related grains. But then I found this yesterday, in fact, which I thought was really interesting. This is a symposium on plant genome engineering moving from the lab to the field that will be held next week. All right, so here, incredible scientists who are, if you're willing to pay them $275 US, will tell you how to move this technology from the lab to the field. We're confident enough in this technology, to put their reputations and out there to teach you how to do this. I also think it's really important to, when you're thinking about this, to understand how deep this technology has gone already, how wide it has become, how diversified it's become, right? I mean, one of the more interesting aspects of this technology is the emergence not only of individual gene foundries, but a whole industry association of gene foundries. And basically, if you can imagine a sequence, if you can design a sequence on your computer, you can just send a sequence to them and they will make the chemicals for you and they will mail them back to you and you can do with them whatever you like, right? And it's not exceptionally expensive to do that. So maybe at the moment there aren't many examples of gene editing in plant breeding, but it has been enough of an issue to have drawn an opinion from the European Commission and from the European Intellectual Property Office. And as you see, the commercial world is full steam ahead on it. I think another reason we need to reflect on, another aspect we need to reflect on is why DSI is important for ABS. And I want to start off here by saying that I largely agree with Anke that the ABS system as it is instituted at the moment, and particularly given its very bilateral architecture, which comes from the history of the CBD and from the history of the Nagoya Protocol, is a problem. Right? The fundamental problem there, and the problems that Anke raised on innovation are in fact not particularly problems of DSI. They are problems of the ABS system as it functions at the moment. Right? I think it's really important to also bear in mind the history of why that bilateral architecture exists in the ABS system. Right? The ABS system comes out of a debate that was started in the 1970s with the Stockholm Conference and then followed up by the Brundtland report on environment and development in the context of a decolonization narrative around the world. Right? Countries that were fighting for independence from colonialism. And India in 1948, and I know that it was a horribly traumatic experience with the division of your country. And I don't want to go into that history, but I want to remind everyone that the reason sovereign rights over genetic resources were recognized in the CBD and why the doctrine of the common heritage of humankind was abandoned. Well, I want to actually, let me just take a moment out there. The common heritage of humankind never ever applied to genetic resources, right? In fact, the history of genetic resources shows very clearly that they were quite tightly held in certain cases. In colonial Indonesia, for example, the Dutch would put you to death for smuggling propagation material of spices out of their colony. Right? And the Chinese would put you to death for smuggling silkworms, and the silkworms reach Europe actually by being smuggled. All right, so the idea that there was a common heritage is just wrong. And the spread of crops around the world, to a very large extent, was an instrument of colonialism, right? The tea came to India from China by British took it there. The rubber went from Brazil to Southeast Asia because the British took it there. All right. And it was a really horrible system. I don't have to remind you as former colonized people about this either, right? It was based on war, it was based on misappropriation, it was based on slavery, and then it was used to develop the industrialized infrastructure and and fuel the industrial revolution, and all of the problems that that has led to, that we now recognize in climate change, in biodiversity loss, and all of that, right? And it led also to the rivalry between the great powers, and then it led to the World War, and then after the World War, the system broke down, and decolonization got going. And within that decolonization narrative was a very important aspect of that, was the permanent sovereignty of developing countries over their natural resources. Right? The world said, never again will colonizers be free to take your genetic resources and do with them whatever they want. Right? And that, because that was a very important aspect, and by then the world had recognized the value of genetic resources. In fact, when ABS got discussed, the demand in that discussion was for access to genetic resources, and it came from the developed countries. And the developing countries said, well, no, you can't have that unless we have a way of using that to drive our economic development. And that's why, in fact, the benefit sharing bit of the CBD, which then later got transferred into the international treaty and other international instruments, was in fact a compromise that made that whole instrument, the agreement on that instrument, possible in the first place. Benefit sharing was introduced in the end as a compromise element to get developing countries to accept the CBD. And that's important to bear in mind, because that is the reason why there's no article in the CBD on benefit sharing, and why, in fact, we then had to negotiate further and eventually negotiate the Nagoya Protocol, but we never really managed to get away from this bilateral architecture where a sovereign country has control over the resource. It grants its prior informed consent. It negotiates mutually agreed terms with the user. And then somewhere down the line, depending on the length of the development period, some benefits get shared with the country of origin or with the community that it provided the resources or it provided the traditional knowledge. And that bilateral architecture is what the plant breeders and the researchers and many other scientists are now finding is controlling or preventing easy access to resources, is involving a whole lot of red tape and negotiations, and is stifling innovation and stifling research. And on the other hand, developing countries are finding that that bilateral architecture is not really delivering benefits either. It slows down the whole process of putting ABS measures into place. And I agree with Antje that the benefits that have been shared have been very disappointing. They've been especially disappointing when you look at them in the context of mobilizing resources for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, where the latest information from the Dasgupta report that was published like 2 weeks ago estimates the funding gap to be about $700 billion a year. Right? So just, I mean, for context, that's approximately 1% of global GDP is what we need. So that's also an important thing, I think, to bear in mind. We're not just talking about expectations of benefit sharing, we're actually talking about well-founded economic arguments about how much benefit sharing do we need to have to save biodiversity and use it in a sustainable way. So that's ABS briefly, and I didn't put a slide on that in because I wasn't going to talk about that very much, but in response to what Antje had to say, I thought I would better throw this in. Okay. So, I mean, DSI is important for ABS within that context that I've just described, because the new technologies really is the big thing, right? I mean, sequencing is now very cheap and easy. Sequencing the human genome took 20 years and cost like billions of dollars. Now you can sequence it like a human genome in under a day for, they're now aiming for $100 for a whole human genome. And also, as was pointed out in the opening remarks, the vast growth in internet and technology and communication and, just shared data storage space and the ability to share data and so on. The other aspect of it is that at the moment you have these global open access databases in the International Nucleoside Data collaboration, right? But there's also more than 1,000 of other databases, and there's no information whatsoever about, not even meta information about the data held by the private sector. But what we do know is that there are large companies that they constantly update. They have their own copies basically of the INSDC database, and they update them every day over FTP server, and then they use them in-house along with the data that they've created themselves. Yeah, but we have no idea of how much there is and how many companies are doing that because it's not a transparent process. So DSI does make it possible to bypass access to genetic resources for many purposes. For some, you still need a physical resource, right? I mean, you can start designing a vaccine against COVID because China quickly published the gene sequence, but then when you want to test your reagents, for example, you then need access to the virus itself. So it's a substitute, but it's not a complete substitute. I think that's also important to bear in mind. But because there's no access regulations, and currently benefit sharing is tightly tied to access and to prior informed consent and mutually agreed terms, there's no benefit sharing or the obligation or a reduced benefit sharing obligation. And then, of course, there's the issue that in developing countries, and this is, I'm sure, more true for other developing countries, not so true of India and China and Brazil, and South Africa maybe, but for the less developed countries of the developing world, there's very low capacity to benefit from this data availability. And although our negotiating partners have been saying, oh, well, we will give you more capacity development, by now, 35 years after technology transfer and capacity development was offered in the CBD and never implemented, this is no longer, in my opinion, a credible promise. This is just a promise. If we accept it, we will again get nothing. There is, however, I think in the plant genetic resources community, there are some building blocks. There's some consensus about what is important, right? And one of them is that we are all mutually interdependent on plant genetic resources for food and agriculture that come from other parts of the world. That was a very major part of negotiating the multilateral system of the international treaty. And there's also a recognition that the in-trust collections, the ex situ collections of the international gene banks is a major public good, which is, in a way, although it's not a common heritage good, is in fact something that's valuable to everyone everywhere in the world. And as the treaty explicitly acknowledged, facilitated access to genetic resources is a major benefit. And the facilitated access that has come out of the multilateral system has been something like 85% of it for public sector breeders in developing countries. So it's fair and right to acknowledge that this is a major benefit for us as developing countries. Of course, within that, the associated data, what do you know about the accessions that are in the gene banks is really important. And although when Article 17 of the treaty was agreed on the global information system, nobody imagined that you would have complete genomes of 20,000 plus barley accessions like readily searchable on the internet. It's clear that DSI has very much enhanced the value of this associated data. And it's also an agreement in the, because we've spent 6 years trying to negotiate it, that the multilateral system of the treaty does need its functioning enhanced. It needs to include more materials, it needs to include more information, and it needs to generate more benefits for conservation and sustainable use of plant genetic resources. And there's also an agreement in that process that measures are needed to build trust between providers and users. And there's a general recognition, I think, of the important role that farmers and their rights play in the conservation and ongoing evolution of in-field, in-situ genetic resources. And there's, of course, in the treaty itself, explicit provision that this is what the benefit sharing fund is supposed to support. So just in a general sense, there is consensus that it's important to support in situ conservation and that benefit sharing is the way to do it. There are also some things on which we don't agree, where we have divergence. Right? One of them is how important it is that improved commercial seed is displacing in situ genetic diversity and the associated ongoing selection and evolution that happens through annual selection of seed and seed saving and intra-community seed exchange. In my view, this is an enormous problem. It leads to a whole lot of genetic erosion. And of course, while we can't expect the farmers to be the conservators on their own or without any support, it's also really important that the seed industry recognizes its role in displacing this on-farm genetic diversity and takes a more active role in countering that genetic erosion. Okay, so there's no, there's also divergence around the fact that about how important facilitated access is and for whom. All right. So for the public breeders, as I've said before, that's no doubt there's a big value in it. But the seed industry is not sharing the commercial benefits from access to the world's genetic resources, and there's inadequate support overall for in situ conservation work. And we don't agree on that. So one of the outcomes of that is that the in-trust collections in the multilateral system largely avoided by industry. They tell us because the SMTA is defective, and we accept that, and we've tried to renegotiate that. Another problem is that the global information system is actually firmly anchored within the INSDC architecture. Excuse me. And that the INSDC has an uncompromising ideological position that data should be free. So for them, it's not a matter of practicality. It's an article of belief. Again, within the treaty space, as has been said before, these efforts that we made over 6 years to enhance the functioning of the multilateral system were ultimately undone in November 2019 at GB8 by our inability to resolve the issue of DSI. And I think that there are three main reasons why that happened, right? One of them was that there's a reluctance on the part of countries that have not ratified the Nagoya Protocol to put additional material into the multilateral system because they see that they might be able to get more benefits through using at least certain material, sharing it under a bilateral ABS agreement. So those parties think that mutually agreed terms for the use of DSI would be appropriate. And our right to think at least that the access to DSI should respect their sovereign rights over their genetic resources for all of the historical political reasons that I outlined earlier. I mean, maybe the most intractable problem of the discussion in Rome at GB8 was, how do you stop the DSI from the treaty material, from the multilateral system, from being used for purposes that are not permitted by the treaty, right? I mean, the treaty makes it very clear that the multilateral system is for breeding, education, and sustainable agriculture, right? So it's not for bioengineering, it's not for pharmaceutical use, it's not for biotech in general. So how do you prevent that leakage out of the treaty space? Because once the sequence information goes onto a database with no terms and conditions, then of course it's free to use for any purpose whatsoever. And at least the African position was that, well, at least under the subscription system, where subscribers are paying an annual fee towards the benefit sharing fund, this could still be maybe acceptable. But then what about those who insist that they should have occasional access to the genetic resources in the treaty and have free access to the pure DSI that's on the databases? An additional problem, I think it hasn't helped, but it's not so particularly so important for DSI, is that industry hasn't included its material in the multilateral system as the treaty foresaw that it would, and has also not included its DSI in the system very often, or has included some of the DSI and not of the others, and we don't know what they've put in and what they've put out. I saw some research the other day saying that at least 2 million corrupted entries on the INSTC databases. And some of the more paranoid people in this space have said that industry is deliberately corrupting sequences by encoding them. And so they could get them back with like a key to decode them, but you can't trust anything deposited by industry as actually being a real sequence. I don't share that view, but I mean, there are people who think like that. And then, of course, there is a very big divergent treaty, and there has always been, about farmers being robbed of their rights by intellectual property, and especially by native trade patents, which then prevent farmers from sharing seeds and saving their own seeds, etc. And I thought we'd made some progress on that, in fact, in that at least the treaty was willing to call on industry to exercise intellectual property in a way that didn't, have this effect.
Data sheets.
Okay, so we failed. I mean, this basically, we failed the GBA to reach consensus. There's no program for further work on that. And there have been some informal consultations, but to a large extent, they've been frustrated by the pandemic. And there hasn't been very much progress made on them as far as I know. And I would flag this is an important issue for India. If you're going to host a successful GB9, it might be time to try and restart those informal consultations as the host of GB9. Of course, in collaboration with the Bureau and the Treaty Secretariat, etc. Then, as previously pointed out, DSI is also now on the agenda at the CBD, the Nagoya Protocol, the Commission, the FAO Commission, the PIP framework, more generally in the WHO around pathogen sharing, and in the General Assembly negotiations on biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. In the CBD, there were studies, then there was the ad hoc technical expert group, there's some further consultations going on. It will be taken up again at the open-ended working group, at the third meeting of it. Will actually be the first time where the topic will be taken up so in a substantial way, in a formal process. And then from there, it will go to COP15. And there's a very great risk that unless we can come to some sort of agreement on benefit sharing for DSI, then the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will not be adopted in Kunming whenever that COP takes place. It's certainly the African position that unless there's benefit sharing for DSI in that framework, we will not be supporting the adoption of the framework. There also seems to be a growing consensus in the discussions that have been ongoing that the only way to deal with this issue is to have a multilateral approach to benefit sharing. Because that would help you to avoid many of the problems that go with negotiating bilateral access on particular sequences. And it would also remove the problem of tracking and tracing, and it would deal with the problem of many sequences occurring in different resources, etc., etc. But there hasn't really been a serious international discussion about how you can make this work. On the other hand, many developing countries already have in their legislation provisions regulating the use of DSI, and they do it also through mutually agreed terms where they prohibit a user from sequencing the information or from putting the information on an international database. And as this tendency grows, of course, the whole international system of curating DSI and using DSI will be undermined, and it will be suboptimal. It will underperform relative to its potential. So I think some of the questions that we need to look at is whether we need a sectoral or universal solution for DSI. Okay, so I mean, one of the one of the issues is that the INSDC seems very reluctant to engage even in a discussion about changing their rules and regulations, and have resisted the call that they should add terms and conditions for material from the multilateral system or from the global information system when that is hosted on their servers. And also, it's become quite clear in recent discussions that the vast majority of scientists would also prefer to have this data stored in one big database. There seems to be a real reluctance with the idea of specialized databases with separate terms and conditions. And in a way, it's not hard to understand that problem because, the more legal arrangements you have to deal with, the more complicated any particular usage becomes. Then, of course, there's a possibility that the enhanced multilateral system of the treaty and the revised standard material transfer agreement could address DSI directly. But it could only do that if the multilateral system has a dedicated database with terms and conditions on the SMTA. In other words, you would be able to access DSI from treaty material, but you would be bound by the terms and conditions of the SMTA. There's been some discussions around this in the informal consultations. And it's a potential solution, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of enthusiastic support for it. However, if we can agree on the details, then at least the CG centers would be obvious hosts for such a database because they manage this material and this information anyway. Or the plant genetic resources community can take its chances on the CBD reaching consensus on a global multilateral ABS solution for digital sequence information in the post-20 global biodiversity framework, and then hope that all contracting parties to the treaty and farmers will accept this solution. There's still some things that we need to further reflect on, all right? Can the CG Center actually run and support such a DSI database? Is there the political willingness to establish and support a parallel data ecosystem outside the INSDC? This might be cheaper though than you think. I mean, it's not actually that a bigger step. So one of the objections I've had is that it will cost a lot of money. In fact, it probably won't in the overall picture cost that much more. If you go for the universal solution, then will the benefits from plant genetic resources for food and agriculture leak out into the CBD Global Fund and be used to support the conservation and sustainable use of non-agricultural biodiversity? And is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, some people would argue that since agriculture is one of the great drivers of biodiversity loss, it would only be fair for agriculture to make a contribution to the conservation of biodiversity more generally. Well, there's also then the question of whether the governing body of the international treaty can lay claim to a certain share of the resources that is generated through a global system to use for the provisions of the benefit sharing fund. In other words, to support farmers in developing countries who conserve and sustainably use plant genetic resources for food and agriculture. There might be opportunities, as I pointed out, to resolve this tension and dichotomy between farming and conservation. And that might also then extend to genetic resources for food and agriculture more generally. The livestock breeds and the forestry resources and the aquatic resources and the microorganisms and the invertebrates and all of those things that are important for food and agriculture. If you can come to a solution that puts in place a multilateral benefit sharing system, you can have, against the assurances of multilateral benefit sharing, an open access system where open access no longer means free access, and what is access remains to a certain extent under the control of sovereign parties to the instrument. But that would certainly help to solve many of the problems that Anke raised, and that, as I pointed out, are related not to DSI in particular, but to ABS, and ABS being exercised in a bilateral way. And so if you were to go for a comprehensive, ambitious, transformative solution, which is what we are talking about in the CBD and in the Global Biodiversity Framework, then maybe you can solve many of these additional problems at the same time. And a much more specific topic, because it's close to my heart and close to the work that I used to do, maybe this would also then provide opportunities to move orphan crops and underutilized species from Nagoya into the multilateral system, where there would be more expertise and more funding and resources available to work on them. And they would be better positioned to play the role that I believe they can play in, for example, climate change adaptation and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Shipere, for that eloquent presentation. If the co-chairs permit me, may I suggest that first we go for the comments from the members of the panel. Then I have noted down few questions from the participants, and I'll pose those questions for the panel as well as the speakers, so that we save on time and then we don't repeat similar things.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes, we can quickly take the views of the panelists.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. We have the program, all of us have the program in our hand. So may I now request Dr. Rana. Dr. Rana was a former director of NBPGR. He's an expert in access and benefit sharing. He has been heading the Agricultural Biodiversity Panel in the National Biodiversity Authority. So he has been in touch with all these developments. So may we have your comments, please, sir?
Thank you, Punit. Technology advances. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. Technology advances in accessing and using digital sequence information on genetic resources are welcome developments. They have raised expectations of the end user of these products, especially in health and agri sectors. It beholds the global community to rise to the occasion and formulate enabling policy framework. After listening to the introductory remarks by Dr. Aroda, Dr. Sandeep Singh, and Dr. Sunil Atta, and also presentation by the two eminent speakers, let us first take stock of some realities at the ground level to carry this discussion forward. One, digital sequence information on genetic resources, DSI in short, doesn't have a precise and agreed upon definition. Both speakers and Pere have emphasized this. Many discussion groups have looked at it differently. Ideas are still evolving, but the term relates to both genomes of bioresources and associated traditional knowledge. And if you look at the crop plants, medicinal plants, farm animal breeds, they carry valuable genes for adaptation to climate change, the focus nowadays. Second, there is also a notable capacity differential globally, since only some nations appear to be engaged in such technology development and application. Most contested aspect remains the IPR related issue. If Pierre doesn't mind, I would like to say that sovereign rights are not really much related to the pre-independence era of some developing countries. But in fact, the problem arose when the varieties started getting patented. Then came the UPOF 1978. Then some countries, developed countries, they were not satisfied even with the exemption for researchers and breeders and came to a stronger version of 1991. The CBD came later. Researchers require incentives. Investors want good returns on their investment, but these expectations need to be balanced with rights of conservers and providers of the genetic resources. Based on my close working association with NBA for nearly 17 years, I am no longer a votary for sharing of monetary benefits, but I like non-monetary benefits to be elaborated. I strongly want unrestricted access to protected products by researchers and breeders. The nodal ministry for implementing CBD in India, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, has constituted an expert committee to help in developing India's options for forthcoming negotiations, and we may like to link with that later. Let me recall that DSI, as mentioned by the speakers also, was first discussed at the global level in 2016 by the CBD COP13 and the Nagoya Protocol meeting of parties too. They took note of rapid developments in this area and recognized it as a cross-cutting issue relevant to all the three objectives of the CBD. Since then, it is under active discussion by several fora at national, regional, and global levels. Ongoing discussions under the UNEP CBD, FAO International Plant Treaty, the WHO, and the Law of the Sea do not appear to move towards any convergence. In 2018, 2 years later after the Cancun negotiations, this issue remained highly controversial yet again in COP14 meeting, with negotiations remaining deadlocked. An informal virtual meeting of the sub-staff CBD held last week. The proceedings have become available this morning. Discussed synthetic biology, including digital sequencing information on genetic resources. Considering that products developed using DSI and synthetic biology technologies may be treated as LMOs and handled under Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety to the CBD, need to use a precautionary approach with regard to organisms with engineered gene drives was stressed in this meeting. It was also suggested to have a horizon scan of development in synthetic biology led by a multidisciplinary technical expert group. The regular sub-staff meeting to be held next month will discuss this matter. In this context, the use of precautionary approach is already enforced under the CBD, and our group may also recommend it to the government to follow it. It may be discussed further whether to support the constitution of a multidisciplinary expert group for horizon scanning of developments in this area of active research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anna. Sir, very precise and clear comments and very important bullet points. We have noted down all of them. We will deliberate them internally as well as take them with whenever we have interministerial meetings here. We have noted down everything, sir. Thank you very much for these comments. May I now invite Dr. Dhillon, former Director NBPGR and presently Vice Chancellor of Punjab Agriculture University. Sir.
Thank you, Dr. Archak. Thank you very much. My thanks to the organizers for this opportunity. It's a learning experience for me. So taking position at this moment, I will say that is out of question. I moved away from genetic resources a long time back and got busy other things. So I must admit, I have limited knowledge on this subject, so I will be very, very precise. I really enjoyed what the question posed by Dr. Hurke. Is it wise to regulate it? Is it possible? Whose ownership is it? But I like the most the title by Dr. Places, dematerialized assess, dematerialized benefit sharing. So question marks on benefit sharing, which were in our mind when international treaty was being negotiated. I will come to that later on. But it is an unbelievable journey for maybe Dr. Proda, Dr. Rana, and person like me who are now above 70. Moving from Green Revolution, everything was available. You talk to anybody from Thailand to US universities or to International Institute, get the germplasm, and then came the CBD. And even in India itself, Dr. Proda raised the question many times that why and from India germplasm is not going out. We restricted our thinking and germplasm exchange in spite of the fact whenever we had MOUs with other colleagues, still we hesitated. But I feel happy that this time change is led by technology, not like WTO, when IPR consideration or economic consideration was on the top. Now it is technology, it has become so easy to sequence the genome. The question is, I will just try to touch one or two questions, not many. What is more important, genetic resource or DSI? Definitely DSI based on genetic resources, and genetic resources it has taken so much time to develop these. And at the moment, those who are conserving it, they are conserving at some cost. If 12th world is conserving and developing world is using it, so there has to be some sort of compensation. Why go away? Let us talk about India. Indo-Gangetic plains versus Himalayas. In Himalayas, how long we should expect those in Himalayas, Uttaranchal or Himachal to conserve the resources because Punjab, Haryana and Uttar Pradesh may need it. So there has to be some sort of you can say compensation mechanism, whatever it is. Then benefit sharing, I'm really now surprised. Yeah, when we were talking or discussing in international treaty, people like me, others from Malaysia, I still remember Mr. Lim, and from Iran, very active person, gentleman, one from Somalia, I remember name of some, not of others. We always said that, please, benefit sharing should be more strict, more strict. So, no, it will work, don't worry, it will work, it will work. And time constraint, the acquisition of the germplasm and then using it, keeping proper record, etc., the complex pedigree, what was shown by Ms. Hurke. All these things we were apprehensive at that time and wanted to be more explicit and more strict. But we are sure time and again, no, these things will work. Now these very things are being put in the opposite, what we were saying earlier. But benefit sharing is important, it should be there. And when you talk about India as a beneficiary, yeah, India is different. We are neither many countries in our surroundings, I will say, why to talk of Africa all the time, and many countries in Europe and of course North America, both the country in North America. We are somewhere in between. We don't represent the world. And in India also, on one side, we have a CRIP system, I will say, because NARs include both private and public. Which sector is doing what? And which sector is gaining, which sector is not gaining? Then I feel happy that Mr. Police is, about benefit share. There was a question that the information will not be shared. It will not be put in public domain, this DSI. I'm really surprised. In late 90s, just read Crop Science and Geophysical paper by Mr. Trier, A.F. Trier. He has written that the information generated by private sector in the company which he was working, I think he was working in Pfizer Genetics. Sorry, I have left me a long time back. He has written it is in black and white that the information generated by us is published 15 to 20 years later because of hyper issues. So these things are happening earlier also, but we are working and making progress. Not taking much time, I'll go back to what Dr. Palacios has said, that there is some sort of some points where we can go. Yeah, multilateral system. And let there be multilateral database platform where DSI information should be put on. This I will say very good suggestion. Meanwhile, we should have more discussion, more deliberation, try to learn each other concerns. And then I am very hopeful we'll come to some consensus. I think taking position at that time, it will be very, very difficult. For a person like me, I am just thinking whole circle, moving from free flow of germplasm, then restricted flow, and then again going for free flow of, it is again germplasm, or you could say dematerialized germplasm, or whatever term we want to use. Once again, thank you very much to the organizer for this opportunity. Really, had I missed this thing, I have missed many things because I'm dealing now from such things. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. We have noted those points. Indeed, we also agree that there is a lot of time before we learn and then reach some kind of a consensus and take positions. May I now invite Professor Kailash Bansal to make his points, please. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil, and thanks to the organizers for this opportunity to me. And as we have seen from the presentations made already by two eminent speakers, I think the issue is quite complex. There's no doubt about it. And to me, it appears that if we go back and see the kind of days we had during the times of Green Revolution, when it was free for all, the exchange of generic resources, and we were able to witness this Green Revolution. And as a result, particularly in countries like India and others, we have today self-sufficiency. And that's all because of the free availability of these generic resources across the world, and dependence, as was mentioned by the speakers as well, on this PGRFA, interdependence globally. But I think in the last about 70 years, since the time we had witnessed Green Revolution, we have come a long way. And particularly with regard to the use of science and technology has played a very big role. I mean, in the last 100 years, if we see, we had conventional plant breeding, we have moved quite away from it now, and we are into this era of, genomics and genome editing, etc., as mentioned before. And of course, at the same time, we do have these issues of climate change and conservation of biodiversity or loss of biodiversity, particularly from the farmers' field. And all those issues are very much there. But to me, it appears personally, actually, this is my own scientific perspective today I'm able to give, I hope, and mostly as a human being or citizen of this global village, the whole world, is this that, I think the scenario really changed when CBD came into being in 1993. So can we try to, in fact, I don't know, it's too difficult to go back onto that kind of an era, like we are struggling in India, to revisit National Biodiversity Act, all kind of biodiversity rules we framed in 2004. So is there a possibility? I don't know. I said I'm thinking while it's a brainstorming session in trying to think while that, is there any possibility of revisiting, for example, CBD itself? The convention where we have wonderful 3 objectives, there's no doubt about it. But the last one, particularly, the access and benefit sharing in an equitable and a fair way. And as was mentioned by Yankee, there's no discussion at all on this. What is that equitable and fair way of accessing this benefit sharing, particularly for the farmers, of the developing countries, including India, whether in monetary terms or in terms of non-monetary terms. And I was rather surprised to see what, Dr. Perry mentioned clearly, that even after 35 years, it has not really been implemented I'm talking benefit sharing to that great extent as it would have been expected. And as I know myself, being sometimes the member of governing body participation, ITGFRA, there are no funds available for sharing, because we probably did not realize that before we start sharing these benefits, to the contracting parties in one way or the other through the kind of the fund we have, benefit sharing fund of the treaty. I mean, like it will take at least 20 years before this funds will start pouring from, particularly, let's say, commercialization of these products from the private sector and all. So what I believe that's one thing that if we can really revisit and could be a special convention discussion on the rules and regulations, sharing of the seed as a physical resource by itself, whether that we have been able to implement fully well or not the way it was chalked out. And second, today when we're talking, I said, because of this technology advancement, science and technology, we are into DSI. And DSI is going to stay. We must recognize its importance at the earlier possible thing. And quite possible, as has been there's a fear that probably we will lose the whole concept of sharing these physical resources as seeds. Once all these pangenomes, super genomes become available, 3,000 rice, more than 3,000 chickpea, even barley, the mention was made. We're talking of one earth biogenome. So what I'm trying to say is that DSI is going to be rather important. And to me, it appears that there are certain concerns with regard to DSI, that whether it should be treated as some scientists say it's nothing but whether it's a traditional knowledge associated with seed or not. And some people say it's only data, it's only information. And so they don't relate, for example, any sort of benefit to it when we talk of its utilization for crop improvement or some of the sequences of DNA which have got a value for adaptation, climate change, resistance to biotic and abiotic stresses. So I believe it is not only data, it has a valuable information. Today we are judging this natural genetic variation. And even today, when we're talking of developing these scores and characterization of the germplasm, it is all based on natural genetic variation at the level of DNA. So to me, it appears when we talk of what is DSI, the definition is very important. It should cover, to me, it appears mostly the DNA itself, because then only you talk of RNA, that will all be encompassed when we talk of RNA or a protein or transcriptomics, etc. will all come into this domain, particularly when we talk of the DNA sequence alone. So we have to take care of a few of the things. Of course, number one, I said before, DSI needs to be defined well, and whether it's a relatively traditional knowledge. Can you take it equivalent to a physical resource as a seed, or and can we then try to promote the use of these plant genetic resources as we all talk about it, conservation and utilization of plant genetic resources for global food security. So in that case, it is important that yes, we should have an open access to all this information of DSI. We're talking of digital sequence information or different ways, or basically I'm talking of DNA sequence of an organism in a part or full as a genome, as a genomic complement. I think this is important. They should remain to promote the utilization of plant genetic resources for the global food as it is at the moment, from different gene banks, as we all know, from NCBI or from EMBL or from Japan. This is all available easily. But at the same time, it is important to find value into those genetic resources conserved by our farmers. As it has been already there, the very protocol, very basic basis of Nagoya Protocol, that should also be in fact realized and kept into mind. It cannot be, because since the plant genetic resources are not free for all anymore, so I believe DSI should not be also free for all. At the same time, it should be regulated in a manner that we still promote the use of plant genetic resources for food and security, nutrition security, because it has a value, and we should try to differentiate the users, because ultimately it boils down to, when we talk of these monetary gains and utilization of these resources, we have got public sector, we have got a private sector, you have got NGOs, you have MNCs, their presence globally. So therefore, it could be that together all of us must try to realize the importance of this DSI, the digital sequence. It has importance. I said before, it could be utilized for various purposes like codon optimization, for genome editing, and even we're talking of synthetic biology. So while we know its use going to increase day by day in whole 21st century in a way, for example, so it cannot be left free for all without strings attached, but at the same time, we have to find a balanced view, keeping into view our experience of physical resources and their access and benefit sharing. I think this is an opportunity if the whole world through the treaty or through particularly I would say to start with CBD along with the Nagoya Protocol, if we can utilize this opportunity to revisit what we have done so far and try to incorporate DSI in a much better way, in a fair and equitable way, it could be shared and still there could be access and benefit sharing attached to it. So this is what I thought in brief I would like to mention. I think it's a very important issue, and globally I would suggest, even I'm sure we have in December ITBFRA 9th governing body session in India. I believe it will, but ultimately again, one more point I would just like to quickly add here is, that unfortunately in many of these governing body meetings, whether ITBFRA or CBD, scientists do not participate. So therefore scientists realize the value of these genetic resources and sequences much more, than the legal advisors. They will be of course there to help us and guide us. But I think scientists should call the shots, in a particular nation. And it is the contracting party's role to take it forward, through mostly the scientists, along with the help from legal point of view or from other experts, those who have for maintenance of conservation of biodiversity. So this I thought are my views, which I totally personal. And if we can take it forward, the questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil.
Thank you, sir, for your inputs and bringing diverse points to the table. I'm sorry, I apologize. I skipped Professor Sharma, former director of NBPGR and then Vice Chancellor in Palampur University.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Sorry.
Sorry, that's my mistake. May I request you, Professor Sharma, please?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Archik, for giving me an opportunity to make few points. The first two speakers, really, they have given very divergent views, extreme views in their own opinion. Anke has mentioned that it would be difficult to regulate, implement, and enforce the DSI. And she's of the opinion that regulation of the DSI will not be of much importance in general. While the second speaker is for the DSI, the benefit sharing on DSI. And I think we, in our country, we need to follow a sort of a middle path between these two extreme points. And I'd like to mention my own comments in a very brief way. And we all know the importance of DSI with the growing technologies, and it is going to have a lot of importance in years to come. The first thing is that the term DSI needs to be globally defined in a way that it is accepted globally. The second important point is that definitely DSI will contribute significantly in fulfilling the first two important objectives of CBD, that is the conservation and the sustainable utilization of the biodiversity. As of now, in the negotiations, there are diverging views of the parties, and the issue is very complex. But with the passage of time, with discussions, I feel that some consensus would be reached. Coming to the Indian context, the DSI is an important issue for a country like India and many biodiversity-rich nations. And the benefit sharing is required for the DSI. Another point is that DSI has not only relevance in CBD and in the treaty, but also for other fora like WHO, WIPO, Convention on the Law of Sea, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. And therefore, all the ministries, stakeholders in our country, besides Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, Ministry of Health, Education, Commerce, should also work collectively to put forth their views. It is not merely the ICR, the NBPGR, or the Ministry of Agriculture, because it's not the baby of one or two treaties or these ministries, but other ministries are also involved. And therefore, their view should also be taken. And whenever there are interministerial meetings or discussions, I think their representatives must be kept on board for their input. In addition to it, all the stakeholders of PGR in the country, academia, institutions, researchers, seed industry, farmers, all those concerned with the digital information and the PGR, their views should also be taken. They must be made aware whether with the benefit sharing with the digital sequence information, how their work is going to be affected and how they would be working, whether they would be able to achieve their objectives or not. So a sort of a awareness among all the stakeholders of PGR is required. And another point which I would like to make is this can be done in our country because we have already national legislations, regulations, and policies relating to genetic resources. And these legislations can be modified by inclusion of DSI in bioprospecting permits in the prior informed consent, mutually agreed terms, material transfer agreement, and so on and so. So therefore, the national mechanisms must have provision or mandated permission to generate sequence, distribute, use in publications, commercial use, and benefit share. Lastly, the Indian position on DSI should be debated in the country, finalized, and made it clear before it is discussed in the COP15 to be held during this year in China, and also in the governing body meeting of the treaty to be held in Delhi later this year. So these were the few points I thought to share. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharma. Sir, thank you very much for all these points. May I now invite the next panelist, Mr. Daniele Manzella from International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources. I would like to just inform the participants that like we have extreme views, we also wanted to have a neutral view, what the managers of this entire treaty think about what we are doing. So Daniele, please.
Thank you, Dr. Archak. Thank you to all the organizers for this great opportunity. I've been on and off due to Zoom issues, but I think I followed the main gist of the two presentations by the main speakers, and I'm following with great interest this debate at the national level, which in fact is a projection of almost all the issues that are also being discussed in international fora, such as the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources and the secretariat of which I represent here today. I'd like to, for 1 second, to step back and I think try to illustrate in a few minutes how the current sort of conundrum over digital sequence information within the policy and regulatory framework of plant genetic resources exemplifies some of the current governance challenges that in fact, in my opinion, do not affect just the global governance of genetic diversity, but also the governance of genomics research and innovation. I think it is beyond doubt that the global frameworks around genetic resources and plant genetic resources in particular were designed to pursue global goals such as biodiversity conservation and sustainable use, but in a context where the informational components were always considered exclusively in relation to the physical material. So information associated, in our case, to physical samples of germplasm. And again, these global governance frameworks were based on the pillars of access to physical samples of genetic material and benefit sharing arising from the use of such, physical samples of materials. As we all know, the increasing use of genetic information and DNA parts as standalone components, which is accompanied with more accessible and improved genome editing technology and assembly tools. There's new technologies making crop research and innovation increasingly dependent on the informational components with a reduced need to access physical samples. And we all know that in the international treaty community, as much as the CBD constituency, have begun considering these implications through the prism, through the entry point of digital sequence information, but so far the attempts to reflect these new topics of relevance into the existing ABS institutions have been inconclusive. And as the latest meeting of the governing body of the international treaty witnesses, discussions are largely polarized around the two conceptions. We have heard this today also from the two main guest speakers, the two conceptions on free and unrestricted access to information for the benefit of open science, and the expansion of ABS requirements to genetic information, to digital sequence information in order to attain equity and other associated societal objectives. We all know that other global fora beyond the international treaty and the CBD are debating these issues, including in relation to the technologies that rely on digital sequence data. National ABS legislation in developing countries is putting forward the requirements in place for research to utilize genetic information extracted from genetic resources under domestic jurisdictions. All this to say that we are all acting in a very contrasted landscape, I would like to touch upon, if I'm allowed for 1 minute, on COVID-19 realities, which, as a recent survey conducted by the Treaty Secretariat demonstrates, may have brought further complications into this contrasted framework. Discontinued management of crop biodiversity will likely result in the loss of some of such essential diversity for food and agriculture, with an adverse impact on the actual capacity of the global crop community to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. As the movement of genetic material, for instance, from crop gene banks, has been discontinued or partially discontinued due to the COVID-19 emergency, data flows have arguably increased. Data-intensive research is actually prioritized, and technology solutions are in very high demand, including in crop research programs. In parallel with that, due to COVID-19 disruptions, program of technical cooperations with developing countries are substantially reduced, with a negative impact on capacity. And in the aftermath of all of this, learning from the urgency to develop critical products and technologies. The paradigms of open access to data and research collaboration are reinforced in science. But alongside with this, civil society and developing countries are continuing to amplify concerns related to benefit sharing as an essential condition for global public goals, for attaining global public goals, and in particular the global public goals that are associated with the management of plant genetic diversity. And of course, many advocate for international cooperation and multilateral solutions to overcome the crisis. But we are all seeing that the dividing lines in the various global governance fora are actually deepened and are even more exposed. How to solve these issues? In my opinion, COVID-19 brings into further focus pre-existing challenges and opportunities for an effective governance of genomic research and genetic diversity. Genetic diversity governance cannot act in isolation from the governance of genomics research at a wider scale. And through this link, in an attempt to create this link, I think all the various communities, the various constituencies, including constituencies at the national level, such as the one that we are addressing today, will be in a better position to recognize and resolve complex tensions among openness, innovation, and equity. And in the case of DSI, specifically among free and unrestricted access to information for science, the control of information in order to extract, capture value and produce innovation ultimately, but also the integration of considerations of inclusion, capacity, sustainability, and other societal objectives to inform the prioritization of needs and the distribution of benefits to diverse beneficiaries. So all in all, there are 2 points after all these general considerations that I've made that I would like to bring to your attention. The first one is the capacity issue. DSI I think, is a formidable challenge, but is also a formidable opportunity to bring at the center of the discourse of the various global governance fora the issue of capacity to participate in research. I think this is a fundamental issue, and I think that the solutions that are being voiced or the concerns that have been voiced in relation to DSI, they might point to these fundamental issues. An issue that experiences such as the experience of the benefit sharing fund within the international treaty have only, I would say, touched upon and have not been able to fully address. The second point that I would like to make is that, and this is almost a personal opinion, I would say, but it's also something that I hear more and more often in the various treaty meetings that we organize. Contrary to common perception and the polarization between, again, free and unrestricted access and equity in the form of benefit sharing, several experiences, for instance, at the meso-level governance of genomics research and innovation, teach us that openness, innovation, and equities themselves, they are not strictly dichotomous, nor do they necessarily divide neatly among distinctions of global north versus global south, Western science versus traditional knowledge, and other similar characterizations that suggest that equitable outcomes can be achieved only through the one-direction redistribution of access and benefits. In my opinion, resolution requires collaborative, inclusive decision-making among heterogeneous actors, each able to contribute experience, information, knowledge, insight, and capacity as well. So there's new governance forms, these new forms of collaborative and inclusive governance, in my opinion, in the context of access and benefit sharing, will unavoidably lead to the experimentation of norms. So I think the various instruments will go through a phase I argue, of experimentation of norms, experimentation of different solutions to a similar issue, so to speak. And I think it's very important that in the various global fora, we create the necessary flexibility, not only for these new forms of collaborative governance to flourish, but also for an experimentation of norms and the communication of, again, of current sort of tensions and sort of solutions that unavoidably will be explored in the various different fora. So I don't think there'll be one global solution to this very big problem. There'll be different solutions. The different solutions will go through an experimental phase, and I think it's a consideration worth of attention to generate the necessary flexibility in the various fora to allow, again, for this experimentation to happen. And I think this is a consideration that I'd also like to bring to the attention of national stakeholders, because obviously experimentation could also happen at the national level. Thank you for your attention, and I'll continue following the debate with great interest.
Thank you, Daniele. Thank you for your views. We have 5 more interventions as panel members. I would like the panel members to make a couple of points so that we are on time. Next panelist is Dr. Vibha Ahuja. I had just seen that she had switched on her video. Dr. Vibha? Yes, she is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And also I congratulate you for at least taking this initiative, the Indian Society, to organize this. And thank you to Dr. Paroda to kindly give me this opportunity. This is a very interesting topic. I think a lot has been said about this use of DSI as we are discussing this evening. I just have 1 or 2 points to make that, we have to, as we draw our position and as we move on, we have to actually very carefully think about the startups and a lot of industry and the kind of research that we are making headway and wherein we are going to use this DSI. Dr. Rana, who has been so much experienced in this particular ABS, working closely with the BDA provisions on ABS in our country, I was quite, listening to him when he said that he would also recommend, with his experience, non-monetary benefits. So we have 2 major questions as we move forward. First is whether we should include DSI as a genetic resource. And I think for that, we every time we have participated in these discussions, whether here or with the Ministry of Environment, we are only talking about, we're still at a preliminary stage of discussion, and with our limited inferences through the experience, or I would say among the stakeholders that are researchers, or just by thinking. But I have a feeling, what I want to say is that we need to actually go on ground, talk to our young researchers who are moving forward and setting up these startups, etc., and take their views on how they would be able to translate products, or how much DSI we are using in our country before we move forward and take a position. So this is my suggestion to the August gathering, because otherwise, we are just talking about based on the views by, let's say, industry association or an NGOs and so on. But we have to go down the level and talk to our industry. We are one of the largest users of DSI, as has been indicated in the studies by CBD. So that all those factors we need to really take into account before we finally confirm our position. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Vibha. We have noted down very carefully the suggestion that in our next deliberations, we will involve all the young entrepreneurs. Certainly, we will take care of that. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Shivendra Bajaj. Yes, please.
Thank you, Dr. Chak, and I would like to thank Dr. Paroda, Dr. Kuldeep Singh for including me in this important discussion. I'll try to be very quick. So on behalf of the industry, our views are that free use of the digital sequence information encourages innovation. And as Dr. Sharma was mentioning, probably the terminology is not very clear. So we propose to this forum the use of a term called genetic resource sequence data. That might bring some clarity on what we are seeking. The focus of any discussion on this topic should include value creation as well as value sharing resulting from the continued access and exchange of DSI or GRSD as we propose. I think Dr. Vibha just mentioned, and Anka also in her presentation mentioned that India is a significant user of the sequence data. The NSDC data shows India, about more than 6% of the users are from India, whereas India contributes about 3.5% to the sequence data. So clearly we can benefit from the open access of the sequences as shown in the database. So if we regulate such database, then it will be a negative impact on the innovations in India. And if we make a strong uh, case for sharing of the DSI or GRSD, we have to be legally certain. The legal uncertainty is time consuming and costly. So, and it also conflicts with the aim of the Nagoya Protocol, because one of the aim of the Nagoya Protocol is to improve the legal certainty, and I'm sure Niti would like to mention certain points about that. Uh, and as Daniel just mentioned about the capacity building, so I think the capacity building is a very important topic that we should focus uh, uh, before we make any decision. It should be more effective, more value sharing, more inclusive, and it can provide significant benefits both to the public as well as private research organizations. Uh, finally, I think this brainstorming session has been very important, and we hope that the GB9 meeting in Delhi will have some kind of a positive decision or a conclusion to this topic. I think uh, we are always for the open access and sharing, and we would like to positively contribute towards this topic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Shivendra Bajaj. Thank you very much for those clear points. Now, may I invite Dr. Niti for the first time to have a legal opinion on these. Niti.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. I would just like to touch 5 basic points which require discussion and clarity. And from legal and commercialization perspective, now the technological use of DSI in a rapidly changing scientific, legal, and policy scenario requires the implications of regulating DSI to be addressed immediately. And this is becoming an increasingly complex challenge, as it is evident from all the comments of all the speakers. And the first point is the definition of DSI. I don't need to highlight it more. If the scientific community cannot come to consensus, then the legal interpretation, whatever it may come out to be, it can have far-reaching implications in future. And therefore, there is an urgent need to have a common terminology in the national, international, and regional level as to what is covered by this term. Second point is ownership. As a lawyer, when I say property, it becomes important for me to see that who does it belong to, whether it is as a product per se or as an IP right. As product per se, product being the big data itself, the ownership, whether it is private or public or sovereign, at which aspect, how much, is important in views of both local as well as international laws. With respect to intellectual property, various intellectual properties like copyrights, trade secrets, patents, plant variety rights, all come in picture when we talk of coverage in terms of DSI. Now, there would be patent claim, which we have seen in several cases for recombinant DNA sequences, which could be even RNA or amino acids. There could be plant variety protection for the varieties which have specific DNA or genes introduced or removed from a genome. India has seen court cases in almost all the IPs related to DSI. Now, the term being DSI used, otherwise DNA or sequence data. For example, the emergent genetic case for copyrights, or the recent Monsanto case related to DNA sequences. And no, I'm not elaborating on the court cases to keep it brief, but there is also possibility to have specific sui generis IP protection to specifically protect DSI. And law is always evolving. New innovations create new needs for protection, either through new uses of existing IP-related technological protection measures for genetic resources as well as DSI, or through creation of sui generis IP rights. Thirdly, specifically taking the regulations for access. Now, whether it is under ITP, GRFA or CBD, it needs to be defined. The limitations of coverage of crops under treaty is a big issue. The existing local laws and the systems under the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol can be utilized. Now, firstly, the access provisions under the CBD have to be seen for the purposes from the sustainable use perspective, which has already been highlighted by Dr. Sharma. And this access could be for research, for local use, for transfer outside the country or region, and most importantly, which is the issue in case of Nagoya, CBD, is transfer for commercialization. And all of these need to be seen separately. Research access and commercial access needs to be distinguished. Open access, access by way of acknowledgement, or access by way of payments, either monetary or non-monetary, each one have to be specifically defined. If required, again, an altogether new system could be considered for access. Fourthly, the valuations. The issues related to valuations for sharing of benefit sharing, for the sharing of benefit. Now, the access issues are nothing when it comes to calculation of benefit sharing. The reward of the innovators is what IP system has been working on, and the prevention of biopiracy is what the CBD is targeting. Now, the right balance is essential in fair and equitable manner to make sure that the valuations are correct. The benefit sharing valuations with respect to the genetic resources itself is very difficult. For example, in case of benefit sharing of patented products, the percentage of net sale value which needs to be shared for the amount of genetic resource used in the final product. The final product may have the genetic resource in very minute quantities or in major quantities. How do you value it? In case of DSI, what would be the basis of valuation of a particular DSI? Would it be the length of the sequence, the number of genes characterized within the sequence, the commercial value of the sequence itself in question, whether the possibility of interspecies use or genus use could be a factor in calculating its value? There's so many points again where ascertaining the value of DSI would be critical. And if the questions are raised before any commercial courts, there needs to be a logical reason for the same. Finally, it is important to assess the ABS issues for DSI in a holistic manner to create the final future system or picture when we see the final picture. If any new system or existing system is modified with respect to DSI, it should be remembered that it may not be limited to the food and agriculture crops, but it may get extended, which is very likely, to other genetic resources like animals, microbes, and even human genetic information. So these are the 5 points I just wanted to bring forth. There are several questions which come to my mind on this topic, and I look forward to learning more with time regarding this evolving important issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neeti, for that very different perspective. Thank you very much. Our next intervention is from Dr. Pooja Bhatnagar from ICRISAT, the one who is using DSI in one or the other terms. So let's have your views, Pooja.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chak, for asking me to be a part of this conversation. And from my lens as a researcher, I would like to sort of highlight a few points. So as you know, I'm a molecular biologist working at ICRISAT, which is a CGIAR research organization. And I work on trait enhancement using both transgenic as well as more recently on the gene editing approaches for precise and accelerated varietal development in smallholder agriculture crops like, sorghum, pearl millet, chickpea, pigeon pea, groundnut, for which there is not a very big commercial interest, right? And I must mention here that my work over years have greatly benefited from the open access genomic sequence information, whether it was generated by CGIAR centers, our own center at ICRISAT, or its partners, or even on relying on some international public databases. So I've been taking advantage of these scientifically, technological as well as scientific breakthroughs that have given us to brought us to a point where we have really good leads in a multiple crops for a number of must-have and future traits, which are becoming more and more important as we are moving forward. So with this lens, of a researcher, I want to draw the attention of this group to the fact that we need to, not lose the sight of the fact that the DNA sequence data, which beyond doubt forms a part of DSI, is generally not used individually, right? It is, but the benefit of it is the value of it is actually through comparison with often many data sequences, maybe reference sequences, resequenced genomes, which the data could be available from anywhere. So, it's important that the collection of all these data sequence, the DNA sequence data in the databases, the value of it is brought in whatever work we are doing for agriculture development, for improving the genetics of whether it is animal or it is crop breeds. And obviously for also the predicting the function of the genes, which then may be utilized commercially by private sector or for public sector research, essentially for international public goods. So I recall Dr. Bansal talked about a few of these points. And in this respect, it must be noted that if the lack of access of these genetic resources, possibly DSI in this case we are talking about in a certain country, does not only affect the potential users like us, who are utilizing this information for crop development or trait enhancement, but also for the countries blocking the access, right? As it may not just lead to lack of benefit sharing, but also isolation of those countries that restrict the access or its genetic resources for that matter, maybe to a lesser extent for technological advancement or for collaborative research, or maybe they might be less involved in international scientific cooperation. So while we are having this discussion here, I think we need to make sure that we keep an eye on some of these things when, as Dr. Vibha mentioned, when we come up with a position on DSI specifically from a standpoint, from the Indian standpoint. And we have already seen that, the access for accessions beyond Annexure 1 require bilateral access, and which at times could take, a few months to a few years. And that's a long time, especially in a current context where we see that the technology is changing almost every day, every week, and it's changing so rapidly. So if we really want to be in the race of having more and more innovations, that is something we have to, as researchers, and the policymakers, need to be really cognizant about. So that's from my lens as a researcher, but I would also like to talk from a CGIAR perspective that CGIAR has its unique advantage, and it has always been in a function of acting as an intermediary and gaining access of technologies developed by advanced research institutes or private sector for that matter, and translating it to the crops which are very relevant for food and nutritional security for smallholder agriculture, right? And this includes the non-monetary benefit in form of collaborative projects, in form of capacity building, and so forth. It is also very critical that as a Article 15 organization, CGIAR has been very forthcoming in developing and making proposals for approaching this issue within the multilateral system of access and benefit sharing of the plant treaty. And that's what governs most of the center's day-to-day uses of PGRFI. And the proposal promotes sharing monetary benefits associated with use of GSI, the genomic sequence information, without creating barriers to the accessibility and the use of GSI in agriculture research and development. And I think that's what is extremely important from an international organization standpoint. And for this, we believe that the subscription system maybe is the best way to proceed. And that would offer beneficial scenarios that limit complexity for the users like us and allow easy access and use for the countries, for the industry, and for the public goods.
Thank you very much, Pooja, for those very clearly.
Neil, we have another 10 minutes to go.
Yeah.
We have to complete by 10 o'clock, by 6 o'clock.
Yeah, sure.
So let us accordingly adjust the time now.
Okay, sure, Dr. We have been talking on behalf of farmers and conservers in one or the other fora or some of the speakers. Now we have one farmer right here who I expect to speak on behalf of all the views the farmers have in India. In fact, he represents a number of regional, national, and international farmers organization. Mr. Tanmay Joshi, would you please make your points, Tanmay?
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Archak. Firstly, for organizing discussions on such an important issue, and secondly, acknowledging that it's not just the legal, not just a space for legal experts or researchers, but also farmers are a very important part of the stakeholders. So I'm Tanmay. I'm a farmer from Central India and I practice agroecology. And I mostly use my own farm saved seeds in my farm, and they are quite different from one generation to another because I use certain techniques, let them evolve in a particular manner, and then do selection processes. And at the same time, I'm also part of Indian Coordination Committee of Farmers Movements, also International Peasants Movement, the Lavia Campesina, and International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty. So having said that, like we have had many deliberations on the issue of DSI, digital sequence information, and there are three very important points that have to be straight away put forward. So one is that DSI and associated knowledge are genetic resources, and they have to be subject to the obligations under CBD, Nagoya Protocol, and the TTIPGRFA. Second, no patent or other intellectual property rights should be allowed on DSI, and it goes by the same logic. Like it's something which the industry should readily agree to, because they have been talking about no restrictions, and even researchers have been talking about, like Dr. Pooja Bhatnagar just said, that there should be no restriction on knowledge, but we are using patents to restrict this knowledge after the researchers and the industry have used it. So this is quite contradictory point of view that the industry is using, and many times researchers fail to understand that in fact DSI is being used to restrict uses for the researchers and peasants in the developing world. And the third point is transparency. That there has to be obligation to publicly declare during the marketing and or registration of a new seeds, DSI and other genetic resources, and the breeding and selection procedures used, as well as IPRs relating to all or part of these seeds. And currently there is no transparency in system. The problems we are seeing, how do we regulate? Because we have failed to, the industry and the developed country, the North has had strong objections on creating a mechanism which will be able to trace back the source and have transparency. So just quickly and short, just to give an explanation to our like why these three things are important to us, is first and foremost that it is important to remember that it is the peasant communities from where the germplasms currently stored in national and international gene banks have come from, and from where DSI has been derived, and these have been commercially exploited by private sector freely with no obligatory benefit sharing happening yet. And it's not just the benefit sharing part, but it's also the same free access has resulted in putting restrictions on us, the peasant community, in return. So it is very important to understand, and thank you, Mr. Pierre Duplessis, for putting out that political historical point of view on germplasm and its origin, and where this idea of ABS comes from. So that we have to understand it from that perspective, each and every issue that we raise. So thank you for that explanation. Second is that we Indians are very much comfortable, especially because we have a very good law which protects farmers' rights, which saves us from these restrictions that might come through patents. But this is, as we can see, the current scenario that laws are getting changed in a matter of days at the whim of few in power without undergoing due deliberation and inclusiveness. Therefore, we cannot take refuge in a mere clause in the Plant Variety Protection Law of India to ensure farmers' rights. There are many varied, multiple ways in which the rights are being restricted as well. So we need to keep that in mind. Another thing is the threat of corporate monopolies and restrictions on farmers and breeders. The breeders of Indian public institutes as well from developing world. Patents on DSI are used today primarily to accelerate the concentration of seed industries and restrict access through patents. The large TNCs have built up huge databases of DSIs, which have enabled them to select DSIs of greatest economic and financial values and patent them. They also claim patents to all new genetic modification techniques. Any small or medium-sized company or research institute in the developing world that wants to bring new seeds to the public or to the market inevitably uses genes, DSIs, and or techniques patented by the biggest transnational companies that hold the biggest patent portfolios. These small companies thus fall under the dependence or are directly bought by the TNCs. This concentration of industry drastically reduces the diversity of the seed supply and makes the peasants dependent on a very small number of TNCs to obtain seeds. They are often forced to buy the pesticides and other inputs that are required to cultivate those seeds and sign contracts forcing them to sell their harvest to these TNCs or their branches. And this is not just a fiction, a legal fiction, like Pierre mentioned, that it is not a science fiction. In this case, this is not a legal fiction. In North America, TNCs are using these genes patents or DSIs to criminalize farmers who use their crops for seeds. Article 9 of European Union's Biotechnological Inventions Directive 1998, law applicable to more than 20 European countries, says that DSI can be patented, and these patents are then applicable to all material and products in which such information is incorporated. So direct, it is having direct restriction not just on research but also on usage of physical material. But when it comes to vice versa, researchers, industry says it is not applicable. Another thing is patents on native traits, and that too without traceability. DSIs are now freely accessible on the internet without any traceability, allowing the plant genetic resources in which they were identified to be found. This makes it easy for industry to circumvent the Nagoya Protocol and the ITPGRFA benefit sharing obligation. In addition, TNCs are filing patents on DSIs that they claim to have introduced into various plants with patentable genetic modification techniques. But it describes this patented DSIs in a way that cannot be distinguished from similar DSIs contained in natural or traditionally bred plants. This is why these patents are called patents. This is why these patents are called patents on native genes. TNCs thus claim ownership right over all available plant genetic resources containing the same DSI naturally or through the use of traditional breeding techniques, which allows them to privatize for their own benefit all public collections of genetic resources. And lastly, because I come from a farming background, and I myself am involved in I wouldn't say called breeding, but in seed saving and conserving and diversity management on my farm by doing farming as well. So it is not a farming friendly tool, as I think, because the best farming and seed selection technique has to have evolutionary sciences incorporated to it, as the plants develop in vitro using DSIs bypass these evolutionary processes are therefore very fragile and can only survive and produce in fields when fed with and protected by large amounts of fertilizers and chemical fertilizers. They therefore make farmers even more dependent on the purchases of these inputs, which are often sold by these same seed companies themselves. Their genes and or the genetic information they contain are patented, which prohibits farmers from using their own crop as seeds and forces them to purchase new patented seeds every year, including when they are not F1 hybrids. Like, this is not the real situation in India yet, but it won't be, I don't see it very far if we don't proactively work on all these issues, that there will be a day that we will also have a similar kind of legislations in place. So thank you so much for allowing me to come here and holding these discussions. And I very much appreciate that farmers are recognized to be important stakeholders to be part of these discussions. And maybe hopefully there is a more balanced numbers in such a forums between industry, farmers, and all different stakeholders. Thank you so much, Dr. Archak.
Yeah, you're welcome, Tanmay. Rest assured that farmers are always in our mind in all the discussion with respect to access and benefit sharing. Thank you very much. Now, because of the shortage of time, we have seen that we had little lengthier interventions from our panelists. What I would like to do is, and I have seen all the chat box interventions, they're all basically the opinions, points that they have made. There are no serious questions there. So all those will be part of the proceedings. So by taking care of that, what I would like to say is we can just directly go to closing remarks by co-chairs. And the co-chairs are Vice Presidents of Indian Society of Plant Genetic Resources, Dr. R.C. Agrawal and Dr. Kuldeep Singh. First, Dr. Agrawal and then Dr. Kuldeep Singh. Dr. Agrawal, please.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. Indeed, it was a very educative and a very exhaustive discussion, which started with the presentation of our two learned speakers, Ms. Anke, our old colleague. I used to meet her during PPFR meetings, and Mr. Pere, whom also we have met a number of times during the meetings. And both have given really a very diverse views. And then followed by the comments from Daniel, and subsequently our panelists, all eminent panelists having much experience in this direction. If you see the last governing body meeting, this was the only issue where everybody was stuck, and it was just left for the next GB meeting, which is in India during this month of December, and we could not have any consensus. So now this is the reason why this meeting has been conducted, to make some kind of awareness and some kind of views, so that we can have the position of India, what position we want to have for this DSI, and also because we are also the chair of Asia, so what the stand of the Asia also can be on this particular issue. Now, if you see the diverse views, I think they are all in many directions, but still we have to see that, yes, we can say that one of the most important issue is that who is the owner of this DSI, as it was told in the presentation, whether it is the person who is developing this DSI, or the country of origin, or the person who owns this germplasm, or there are many such issues. So that we have to see. And as it has been told by Tanmay, as it has been told by many other panelists, whether we can get intellectual property rights on the product developed using the DSI, that also has to be seen. Now, there are many factors which are really contributing for making this accessible. And they are something like government policies, because of which we have to publish our DSI. We cannot say that I don't want to publish this. Scientific practices, requirements by the journals, the funding bodies, and intellectual property authorities, because of which it. So we have to see the regulation for this. I can give one small example. I very well remember when the digitization happened for this monetary things. People were very hesitant in using the ATM cards. They were very hesitant in using the digital payments, and they always used to say the things can be stolen, or I will not do this thing. But we have to compromise with the time. And then subsequently we evolved the laws, we evolved the confidence, we evolved so many things, and subsequently we came out with the confidence in which everybody, I think we are doing very less physical transaction of our currency. But so in the same way, we have to go with the technology, and that we have to debate what kind of mechanism can be really there. If you see, there have been some concerns that whether the DSI is a correct name or not. There are many diverse opinions. We can have genetic sequence data. We can have genetic sequence information, dematerialized genetic resources as it was presented, in silico utilization, and many more things. So that also we have to make a consensus that what should be the correct name for this. And if you see the resolution of the last governing body meeting, in many resolutions you will find the indication of this DSI. And everywhere, even if you see the digital sequence information in resolution 13/2017, which is the basis for this, you will find it was given due considerations, but it could not have any consensus. But now in 2019, there is a resolution 11/2019, which is regarding the cooperation with the CPD. And again, the secretary has been asked to have more watch and more closely see the proceedings of what the CPD is going to do. So based on that, maybe some consensus can evolve during the next GB meeting. And similarly, a meeting in which, Sunil, I think you are one of the members, the Global Information System. So there also a mention has been made in the last GB meeting, and that connects with the DOIs, the Digital Object Identifiers. So there also it is linked that how the application of DOIs to digital sequence information or genetic sequence data, including link to phenotypic and passport data, the genomic data can be explored. So that also has to be seen. And if you see the diverse views by our all eminent experts, I think that will really make a basis for all of us to have some more thinking. As it has been rightly told by Pierre, this is not a science fiction. So we have to see all the directions. We have to see what can be done in the interest of the farmers, in the interest of the country, in the interest of the food security, in the interest of the proper utilization of the genetic resource for food and agriculture. So that has to be seen, taking that as the prime objective, which is the goal of our TT. And then at the same time, we have to also see the access and benefit sharing. So those procedures we have to evolve, and we cannot simply say that we just ignore the SMTA and we don't include any such part. So that has to be seen how we can evolve ourselves. Organically, we can evolve. And we cannot directly ignore the DSI and say de facto open access for any digital information. That also is not possible, but still it's a debatable issue. And the extension of the SMTA to DSI, I think thoroughly it has been discussed, but again, we need to see what are those provisions. Like if you see the maximum revision has been done only of the SMTA, but still because of this DSI, again, what are those sections where we need to have the proper sharing of these benefits, and what are those different clauses where we can involve the points which are emerging from this in this. Then another issue is whether we should go for the bilateral kind of things if DSI is there, or multilateral. In treaty, there is only multilateral. You cannot talk for the bilateral. But that again, some countries, they are just saying, especially the African countries. So whether we can go for the bilateral kind of things or multilateral kind of things. But there are many things. I'm not going to repeat all those points. But I think it has been a very useful discussion. Very useful points have emerged. And this will really make a base for our future strategies, and especially to decide some stand during the forthcoming 9th governing body meeting to be held in Delhi. So thank you all from my side, and thanks each one of you to join this discussion at a very short notice. I think the shortest notice, I can say, just 2 days notice has been given, but we could see whomsoever we invited, they have all participated, and not only from India, from abroad. So thank you all very much again from my side on behalf of the ISPGR and on behalf of my personal behalf. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. I see that a number of eminent participants and then panelists are little upset that we don't have a question answer session. That's just because of the lack of little time here. You may like to see that carefully constructed international agreements and international treaties over decades have been fractured because of the lack of consensus. And just on DSI, we have been discussing on DSI since 2016 now. Yeah, since 2016, we have been discussing DSI, and there has been no consensus. We are not seeing face to face on most of the things, and there are multiple elements on that. And number of elements have not been touched today. For example, what about the multi-purpose crops? Those crops that come under treaty and but also have industrial utilization. What about the jurisdiction of the let's say legal jurisdiction? For example, in Australia, Queensland has said yes, DSI included in some of their text, whereas it is not there in the federal text. So, and all these international agreements are overridden by the national legislation. So it's not very easy and simple. So yes, we agree that we should have question answer session, and our vice presidents agree with me. Perhaps they have already been talking about having a seminar that follows up this particular brainstorming, where we all have greater opportunity to talk to each other and then make presentations and have greater participation from all kinds of stakeholders. That's very essential. We know about that. And with that, I invite Dr. Kuldeep Singh, Director NVPGR, to give remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sunil. I think the divergent views are really important, and this 3-hour discussion has given us a sufficient fodder now to really make up our viewpoints. Most of the things have been beautifully presented by our 2 eminent speakers with viewpoints of their own. And this is in fact what we wanted, the free and fair viewpoints of the individuals, so that everyone can think over it, make up its own individual viewpoints. And ultimately it has to be the national viewpoint to be supported by the governments to be done. So last year in 2019, when we went for the GB8, we had a very clear mandate from the government, and that was an opening remark from India that India is ready to expand its next 1 crops. So that was the viewpoint of the government of India, and that was developed after long deliberations with all our peers as a member of those committee who advised us on that one, discussing all the positive and the negative points of all of those. keeping in mind what Vibha told, that you have to think about the young entrepreneurs, startups, other things. But unfortunately, it was DSI that really restricted any further discussion on expansion of the multilateral system. And that really makes it an important issue to be discussed. And as Archak told, that this was a basis for us, today's meeting, to really prepare ourselves for a national seminar where all the stakeholders will be partners, as was mentioned by Dr. Sharma. So it will be all the ministries, all farmers groups, more NGOs to make up a viewpoint. I would like to make some points which may be a personal points here at the moment. In fact, if we look at this one, no one is saying restriction of the digital sequence information. We're not saying the restriction. Probably it has to be freely available, but what's more important is the benefit sharing, which is arising out of use of that information. And today, in fact, we may feel a little bit hesitant in talking these things. Same was there in 1990s. So when the CBD came into effect, there was a restricted exchange of germplasm, and it remained there for quite some time. And with time, as we understood the things better, and we checked more and more things, the exchange also became more apparent, more wider. And I have the data to prove that one. If we look at the DOI's database right now, it shows use of 120,000 accessions of Indian origin that is being freely used. And most of the gene banks in the world do not have 50. There are only 20 gene banks in the world, including 11 CG gene banks, which have 50,000 accessions in the gene banks. So that's India's role in really expanding the use of the genetic resources. Few more points probably we really need to have in mind, that if DSI is regulated or DSI is not regulated, what will have its impact on the conservation of the genetic resources? That's an important point we really need to ask, a question we need to ask. Another question we need to ask is, will this non-regulation of the DSI restrict the availability of the sequence data? That's another point, probably another question we really need to raise and answer these things. And in fact, in simple words, what in general our viewpoint is that DSI should be a part and parcel of the treaty, not to be kept out of it completely, but ways and means to be identified, to be developed, to see how the benefits arising out of use of that DSI is shared by the groups who are either the originators or who are holders of the IPR issue. I mean, that's what Dr. Rakesh Agrawal raised few questions onto that one. All those things will be sorted out moment we think, we agree that yes, DSI is important, is a part of the genetic resources and needs to be discussed. That's my personal viewpoint here. Thank you, Sunil. And thanks to all the panelists. They have been so good, real divergent views. I think we will have a good stuff for our next seminar, national seminar on this one. And that will lead to a regional seminar. I think this we are going to do in next 2 months or 3 months. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Without taking much time now, may I invite Dr. Anuradha Agrawal, General Secretary of the society that has organized this particular brainstorming, to present a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Sunil. It is my very pleasant duty to extend a formal vote of thanks after a very stimulating afternoon on the discussion regarding digital sequence information and germplasm sharing. At the outset, I would like to immensely thank Dr. Paroda President of ISPGR, and both the Vice Presidents, Dr. R.C. Agarwal and Dr. Kuldeep Singh, for conceiving this program and ensuring that we do it. Although, as already mentioned, we have carried it forward at a very short notice, but it is due to the guidance and fortitude by these leaders that we have been able to make it a reality. I thank each one of you, sirs, and for sparing your valuable time, because coordinating time of all the three individuals was a challenge, as all three of them are extremely busy. Thank you, Dr. Paroda, Dr. Agarwal, and Dr. Kuldeep Singh. Words are not enough to thank both the speakers. It was a real delight to listen to Ms. Anke and Mr. Pierre with their very contrasting views, both very well put, and it has really stimulated the interest of all the participants. We had more than 200 participants today, and from the chat box, we can make out that you have stimulated the interest of all the people, those who were not really thinking that they are directly concerned. But now I think the discussion will start. In fact, I feel today we have started a round of discussions as was done maybe 35 years ago when CVD came into the picture. Then people who were not also directly concerned with policy and matters came into the discussion of management of PGR and the changing paradigms over the last 3.5 decades. Thank you, Ms. Anke, and thank you, Mr. Pierre. You have agreed to our proposal at a very short notice, and we are very grateful for that. I thank each one of our discussants, starting with all our former directors, Dr. R.S. Rana, Dr. Dhillon, Dr. Sharma, and Dr. Bansal, who did not hesitate even for a moment to agree to joining the brainstorming today. Also, Mr. Daniel, Dr. Vibha Ahuja, Dr. Shivendra Bajaj, Dr. Neeti, Dr. Pooja, and Mr. Tanmay for giving the required stakeholders flavor that was that made the discussion very, very interesting today. Thank you, each one of you, for sparing time. We apologize for the lack of time and lack of question and answers. But like has already been mentioned, we will be taking forward today's discussion in the form of a national seminar where we will be, again, hopefully inviting you and allowing a larger question and answer session. Of course, any meeting is only successful with the interest of the participants. So we are thankful to all the invitees. We had given invitation to all the Indian Society of Plant Genetic Resources Life members, as well as all staff of NPPGR. And we are very overwhelmed with the response. Special thanks to all heads of division, unit in charges, officer in charges of headquarters and regional stations of NPPGR, all the executive committee members of the ISPGR who have deliberated in all our meetings to take this program forward. We had a very large gathering of eminent people from ICR, NBPGR, ISPGR, and have listed a few whom we would like to personally thank. Again, apologize for not giving an opportunity for them to come forward, but definitely next time. Thank you all. And last but not the least, the team of ISPGR, which has made this function a reality. Sunil Archak has been, in fact, the great, I would say, the more active partner in convening the entire session and for moderating the session. Thank you, Sunil. We have very silent rapporteurs who will be jotting down all the points you people have made, and we will be coming out with the proceeding shortly. Thank you, Dr. Rakesh Singh, our Joint Secretary, Dr. Amit Singh, our Councillor from North Zone, and Dr. Parimalan. We will be utilizing your notes for making the proceedings very shortly. We have got logistic support from Mr. Vijay Kumar Mandal, our Senior Technical Assistant in NBPGR, and our assistants in ISPGR, Mr. Sunil Bhardwaj and Mr. Arup Das. Thank you one and all. It has been a wonderful evening. And we hope to meet you soon, shortly. Thank you. Sunil?
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
From my personal side, I just want to thank all the three of the colleagues at the treaty. We keep meeting, but they have agreed to talk to us here. Pierre, Anke, and Daniele, thank you very much. And all others, our mentors from NBPGR, because of you, we have learned many things in PGR, and then you can see that it's moving very fast forward. But we want to keep our legs rooted strongly upon the training given by you and then move forward. Thank you very much. And with your permission, we would like to end the meeting today.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much. Namaskar.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye.